Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Farmer Wallace was not in a good mood. He meandered around his cattle ranch like a man with an axe to grind. Even the way he walked significantly betrayed his contemptuous anger. His rock-hard muscular body, developed from years of arduous physical activity, a natural strength training, you could say, from working in the great outdoors, seemed to jiggle with a pronounced indignation, which would have been impossible for him to disguise. To all intents and purposes, if he had entered a bar looking this disenchanted and irked, most of the customers would have lightly given him his space, and possibly even scuttled away, as his inflamed, heated mood was easily perceivable, rather like a noxious bad smell caught on the wind you would do well to avoid. Even the way he stamped his foot as he trudged across the grazing pastures meant the cattle could sense his frustration. And it hadn't escaped his attention that his loyal black Labrador dog Jasper had not been hanging around him all day, which was very incongruous behaviour for his devoted dog. It would seem the dog was not comfortable with the normally easygoing rancher's uncharacteristic behaviour, and had firmly decided hanging around the rancher was possibly not a good idea. Some of his bullocks gave him withering glances through their dark eyes, as if they too could sense it was in their best interest to stay away. It clandestinely irked him that his disagreeable frame of mind had affected everything on his ranch quite profoundly. Indeed, if the trees could have moved away from him, they probably would have done so, like the whispering trees in The Lord of the Rings. But the tall, velvety alpine trees on this ranch were well rooted to the ground and weren't going anywhere in a hurry. Indeed, there were some trees on his ranch that had rested on this earth for well over 100 years. He wondered if he really was that unapproachable. When his mood shifted, the animals certainly seemed to think so. Farmer Wallace was the salt of the earth, an easygoing, reticent, demure character who never really had much to say. He had never been a big talker and considered such indulgent trivialities unwarranted, unless, of course, communication required practical application, when you might discuss the requirements of the cattle from a veterinary standpoint, from medical treatments to diet and healthcare. Let's just say in his rational hypothesis, talking about feelings and emotions was really relegated to the female gender. That was what women did, but he didn't have time to waste wallowing in all that nonsensical stuff, where you pandered to the automations of your feelings all the time, like an annoying meowing cat that you constantly needed to appease by giving them a bowl of milk to drink in order to keep him or her happy. But after the fortuitous, enigmatic events of the previous night, his feelings were rising up to the surface, like the bubbles in a bottle of champagne, and he seemed unable to stop the fizz or suppress the strange tugs at his emotions that were being pulled so hard, like church bells ringing loudly in his mind. And try as he might, he could not subjugate, conquer, or shut down those thoughts. Suffice to say, the incomprehensible incident of the previous night made him poignantly aware of how fond he actually was of his cattle herd, and how utterly invaluable his rural way of life had become, But any threats to his lifestyle and his cattle was almost certainly a threat to him, and he knew unequivocally there was an enemy in their midst. The rancher was prudently practical, very down to earth, so his startling outburst of emotions had bewildered even him. He was a diligent, successful cattle rancher that was exceedingly proud of his large, illustrious herd. People might think that raising cattle for beef meant you were indifferent towards your animals, but nothing could be further from the truth. He was devoted to them. Today he felt affronted with a strange, unorthodox attack on one of his bullocks. Wallace was frustrated. He didn't like any nebulous, paradoxical mystery that you could not solve, and was exceedingly bothered that something ambiguously oblique had visited his farm last night. Whatever the hell it was, it had successfully scared his steers rigid, and now this morning one of his bullocks had huge angry gashes across the side of his flank, as if something with monstrously sharp claws had savagely attacked him. Put simply, it was a miracle the poor bullock, exposed to such a malicious treachery, wasn't actually dead. He was thankful for small mercies, but he couldn't afford to allow this to happen ever again. Even losing one animal in the herd was a loss too much for him to incur, as far as he was concerned. Wallace had been a rancher for over 15 years, and had inherited the farm from his wife's father, whom had entrusted it into his judicious care and responsibility, so that he would continue where his father-in-law had left off. And not only did he want to do the old farmer proud, but to succeed as a rancher certainly gave him a sense of self-accomplishment that no money could ever buy. Over the years he'd experienced almost 0 fatalities with his healthy cattle, and was exceedingly proud of that record. He was not going to allow his healthy cattle herd to be scorched by the presence of a menacious predator looming in their midst, who was surreptitiously taking an interest in his steers. By all accounts, the wounds he discovered this morning were like nothing he'd ever seen before. They were exceedingly disturbing, to say the least, but the not knowing who or what had done this to the bullock weighed on his heart very heavily. "What happened here, Wallace?" says the vet, raising a large questionable eyebrow, as he fastidiously administers some antibiotic medication to the steer, while officiously disinfecting and stitching up the infected open gashes that are oozing a nasty mixture of pus and blood. It looked unsightly, to say the least. "I hasten to say to you, a week ago at the Henderson home, you know, the farm a hair's breadth away from you. Actually, they're the farm next door to yours. It would seem something scratched up one of their steers very, very badly like this. The injury is uncannily similar. I think that what attacked their steer has attacked yours as well. But theirs was on the opposite flank, I have to say. I cannot fathom what it is. This is not the kind of wound I would ever expect from a mountain lion, unless he was incredibly large. It would have to be a large wild cat of some kind, but definitely not a bear. It looks like a huge yard fork with 5 knives attached to the end has audaciously somehow plundered the flesh. I mean, I can't imagine a mountain lion would be capable of this much damage, but then again, who knows? They have claws, but not like this, I don't think. Needless to say, the Hendersons are very upset and aggrieved about what happened. They're quite rattled. It seems like all their bullocks have been badly spooked. These injuries are curiously perplexing. There's something out there that is attacking the animals. It's only a matter of time before your cattle start getting killed, Wallace. I need to warn you about that. Indeed, I hasten to say I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. You see, these wounds, they're not superficial. They're treacherously deep. If he had been scratched like this across a major artery, the animal could have bled out quickly and died without question. Whatever did this is capable of doing a great deal of harm to your steers. It needs to be taken down before you start losing some of your precious herd. Also, you don't want your animals to be continuously subjected to stress. It'll have a negative impact on their health. If I were you, I'd put some trail cameras up to see if you can pick up a picture of this thing. Find out what the hell it is.
You want to know what you are dealing with? I'll tell you something for nothing. It beats me. I'm completely floored about this. I hasten to say the Hendersons put up a trail camera, as I had suggested they should, and since then they haven't had any activity on their ranch, so you do well to do the same. Even if the trail cameras only act as a deterrent of some kind, it certainly appears to have that kind of effect on the Hendersons' ranch, which makes me sneakily suspect that this creature you're dealing with is rather intelligent.
Alice regards her husband in horror, as he trudges awkwardly into the kitchen in the early evening, as if he's carrying the entire weight of the world upon his shoulders. She observes her husband's sullen, subdued demeanour, and seeing him in this ruffled-up state is very upsetting for her. The cattle rancher's weathered face looks puckered up with worry lines, and his cornflower blue eyes have lost their warm sparkle, subdued by the weighty heaviness of current events, while the edges of his lips are curled downwards into a sizable frown. Alice has never seen her husband look so discomposed before. The unassuming rancher looks older than his years, but that's what hours spent baking under the Colorado sun can actually do for you. It can be taxing on the skin, but the weathered leathery look rather suits him. It gives him that ruggedly handsome cowboy look that reminds you of those old cowboy characters of the Wild West. At 40 years old, Wallace can proudly boast that he doesn't own a single grey hair, nor has his hair shown any signs of receding, which is bizarre, given his father was bald by the time he was 30. On the contrary, Wallace's hair is thickly luxuriant, where wavy curls literally cascade around his face. But usually it looks quite flattened after he removes his cowboy hat, after a long day spent on horseback tending to the cattle. It would seem the sticky sweat irons out the curls of his hair, giving it that damp appearance. He removes his cowboy hat from his head. His hair, flattened around his face, sticks to it limply. He thrusts it down on the surface of the dresser, which in true traditional farmhouse style is decked out magnificently with a collection of blue and white china plates and casserole dishes. Today he's wearing blue denim jeans, with a huge brass buckle attached to the belt, depicting two bulls standing up on hind legs, very stylish brown leather cowboy boots, and a brown and black plaid shirt that matches his brown velvety cowboy hat. He looks every part the Colorado cattle rancher, and he wears the label proudly, although today his spirits are somewhat flagging. "What on earth is wrong with you, sweetheart? You look exactly like one of those harassed city brokers in Wall Street who's been faced with a colossal stock market crash. Not a rancher who ambles around the fields all day on horseback, basking in the delightful warm shafts of sunlight like you do every single day. You've never worried about a thing a day in your life. And this anxious look, it doesn't suit you. It's reserved for city slickers, but not us simple country folk. What on earth is ailing you? Even your walk today I notice is heavier than usual. Don't think I haven't noticed you stomping around the ranch all day, looking exceedingly disgruntled. I even noticed Jasper hasn't been hanging around you either. He's been lying by my feet all day, and you know that dog loves the bones off you. But he's been picking up your tension as much as we all have. I, for one, don't appreciate a household full of angst. Let me tell you that." "I'm sorry, sweetheart," says Wallace, sitting down at the head of the table, as his wife places before him a large steaming plate of spaghetti bolognese. "I don't wish to inflict my concerns on our family." He glances down at the delectable plate of pasta, toppled with delicious savoury mince, and a pleasing smell of wine, stock, mince and oregano, which brings a reassuring sense of comfort to him. He's surprised how hungry he suddenly feels, reminding himself that he hasn't eaten a thing all day, apart from the coffee he had in the morning, that always gets his engine fired up. "This looks delicious, sweetheart, but then I'm not surprised. Everything you create is delicious. Why do you think I married you?" he teases. "A way to a man's heart is always through his stomach." Wallace tries to make the conversation light-hearted and inject some humour into his words,
but he can't shake off this feeling of impending dread that is literally hanging over him like the smell of a cigarette that has plundered your clothes and you can't eliminate. He has an innate sense in his gut that the injury to his steer is only the beginning of this god-awful nightmare, and that there are more unpleasant, unsightly surprises to come around the very next corner that he's going to need to have to address.
When I'm big like Daddy,
says their 8-year-old son Digby,
I'm going to marry someone just like you, Mum, 'cause you know how to make food taste really nice. Not like Alistair's mum, who burns everything she cooks. Alistair says her food is always horrible, and I agree. When I went to play at his house the other day, the sausages were like bricks. They were so hard, it almost broke my baby tooth.
I hope you still ate them, sweetheart. You wouldn't want to hurt Mrs. Elliott's feelings, would you? Says Alice. It's very rude to refuse food, even if you don't like it. It's polite to eat everything on your plate, so I hope you did. Digby makes a face.
Mummy, the sausages were like rocks, so when we tried to give the sausages to the dog, he didn't even want them. But he wouldn't eat them either, so why should we?
What kind of dog do they have, dear?
I think it's called a boxer. That's right, it's called a boxer.
And he wouldn't eat the sausages you gave him? Well, that's a first. They really must have been rock hard like bullets for the dog not to want them.
Don't be angry with me, Mummy, but we ended up stuffing them down our sweaters. We threw them into the lake.
Well, at least she didn't see you, son. That's all I can say, says Farmer Wallace. But your mother is right. It would be rude to hurt her feelings. But given the sausage nearly broke your tooth and the dog refused it, maybe it has found some redemption at the bottom of the lake.
I don't think the fish would even eat it, laughs Digby.
So what's all this about, Wallace? Asks his wife, removing the apron from around her ample middle, a soft cushioning she's been trying to lose for ages, but it simply refuses to budge. Are you going to tell me, or am I going to have to drag it out of you? I know what you're like. You love to clam up like an oyster in a shell, if given the chance, but I can't let you do that. It's just one of the steers. Nasty gashes across his side. Really nasty. Something attacked it last night very viciously. The cattle are rather unhinged, I have to say. Been on edge all day, they have. I've put up some trail cameras. I'm hoping they'll do the trick, to at least find out what this god-awful thing is. At least that will be a good start. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about, sweetheart, says his wife as she bustles busily around the kitchen and places the large bowl of dressed salad with its wooden salad servers on the long wooden oak table.
What's nothing?
Asked Digby, who was already digging into his spaghetti bolognese with gusto, while his 6-year-old sister Poppy is covered in red sauce and sucking up the strings of spaghetti in her mouth. Her hands are covered with the muck. She's not a neat eater at the best of times, so Alice immediately begins to dab some of the sauce away from her mouth with a napkin.
There we are, sweetheart. That's better. I'm surprised you managed to eat any pasta, Poppy. It's all over your hands and face. Look at you, you're such a mess. Hardly any is in your belly, she teases.
Little Poppy gives her mother a gormless grin and begins to giggle. Alice looks up at her son. Your father was saying, dear, that something attacked one of the cattle last night, and that all the cattle are a little unsettled today, that's all. These things sometimes happen when wildlife interferes with one's farming practices. It's not as uncommon as you might think.
What do you think attacked them, Daddy? Was it a coyote? Was it a bear or a mountain lion, perhaps?
I don't know, son. That's why I'm so rattled. It's the not knowing that's eating away at me. Something out there has its eyes on my cattle. I gather the Henderson ranch had a similar attack, but after they put trail cameras up, they haven't had any problems since. It's almost like this thing knows what those cameras are. Very, very strange, if you ask me.
Oh dear, the Hendersons had one of their steers attacked as well. That's dreadful.
Well, I hope you've put up some trail cameras. Maybe the thing will quit bothering us as well.
I have.
but I still can't shake off this terrible feeling that this could potentially happen again. And that is what's concerning me most grievously." "You need to calm down, sweetheart," says Alice, putting a loving hand on her husband's shoulders. "You can't go fretting like this. It's not good for your health. We'll take it one step at a time and see what happens. We can't jump through loops before we can actually walk, can we? My father used to say that all the time. He used to say that unexpected, fortuitous things that happened on the ranch were sometimes like the pitfalls others might expect in the workplace. Sometimes you can expect to incur losses or events you had not anticipated. It's all part of life, isn't it?"
"You can say that again. I certainly didn't anticipate this happening," says Farmer Wallace, stroking his brown moustache reflectively. "I never bargained to be in such a foul mood today. I can't remember the last time I was this angry. I think I'm going to patrol the place tonight with my rifle. Keep an eye on the cattle. Nothing would satisfy me more than putting a bullet through this thing's head, whatever the hell it is."
A couple of weeks passed by, and everything at the ranch returned to normal. You could have been forgiven for thinking that all that had transpired was unlikely to ever reoccur again, and that it really was a once-off serendipitous event. So things in the farmhouse regained their joyful swagger, and for Farmer Wallace, he was back to his normal self. He began to whistle happy tunes around the ranch, with Jasper following him closely behind, always wagging his tail boisterously. He was a very happy dog. When Farmer Wallace was whistling, you knew all was well with the world. The cattle were also much more relaxed, and everyone was in very good spirits. Alice smiled to herself contentedly as she bustled around the cosy rustic kitchen. She had handed the children 2 large plastic bowls, along with a big sack of peas to pod. "Mind you don't eat them all," she said. "We'd actually like some for dinner." Her 2 children sat down diligently, side by side on the kitchen step, each with a bowl on their lap, and they began to dutifully pod the peas, while Alice began preparing the dinner for the family that evening, and made a start by peeling the potatoes for the beef Maryland she was intending to cook. She ambles over to her children. "How are the peas coming along? Are you nearly done, dears?" But when she looks down at the bowls, they remain untouched, and her children have simply vanished. Where the hell had they got to? "Poppy! Poppy! Poppy! Digby! Digby!" she calls out as she stands at the kitchen door, her eyes focused on the grazing meadow and the sumptuously viridescent woods that flank its outer edges. She is met by silence. Her eyes glance over the terracotta step, and she observes that most of the peas have not been podded and still remain in the large sack, while there are minimal peas in the plastic bowls. Her 2 children are nowhere to be seen. Alice is not one of these women who panics. She was brought up on this farm. It was her father's cattle ranch after all, so she knows it only too well, and she also knows what children can get up to. In her younger days, she had got up to no end of mischief herself, and she wouldn't expect her children to be any different. Well, not really. Kids will be kids after all, and naughty behaviour is one of the hazards of young progeny. One summer, she and her brother Nathan had successfully hidden in the hayloft, while their mother and father had been looking for them for ages all over the ranch. They had found it hilariously funny to see how panicky her parents had become, blindly oblivious to their distress. At the time, Alice thought it was the best game of hide-and-seek she had ever played in her entire life, as both her parents were drawn up into the exciting game and they didn't even know they were playing it. Alice and her brother had found the quintessential perfect hiding place in the loft of all places, where her parents would never think to look. When Alice heard her mother crying and her father calling up the local sheriff in a panic, she decided that the game was probably not so fun after all. She'll never forget her mother's relieved face when she and her brother Nathan miraculously appeared from their hiding places as if by magic, their ruffled, unkempt hair covered in hay. "Where the hell have you been?" her parents had both cried out. Their emotions seesawed and vacillated between anger, relief, and total joy. And the 2 obsequious children just told them that they had been in the hayloft, but made no mention of the fact that they'd been deliberately hiding away from them, as such revelations would have made her parents less than thrilled and rather angry. It was best to sometimes play dumb.
that had always worked with her parents over the years, and the phrase "I can't remember" had always served them rather well when they found themselves in a little pickle. So Alice knew kids and their playful shenanigans like the back of her hand, so she wasn't about to panic for no reason at all, until she had reason to feel concerned. She ran around the ranch with a restrained, rather controlled gait, like a bridled, well-disciplined horse, calling out her children's names. But they were nowhere to be found. But even then the stoic woman didn't allow herself to become unhinged or to flap like a frantic pigeon. The last thing she wanted to do was to tell her husband that the children were missing. She didn't want to cause him any consternation, as over the last 2 weeks her husband's worries had taken a lot out of him, and she could see of late the worry lines on his face had definitely grown significantly deeper. She didn't want to add to the stress. The kids had to be around here somewhere, surely. She hoped to God that they weren't playing the same hide-and-go-seek game she had played on her parents when she was young. Maybe there was a karmic lesson of divine justice in this somewhere, and she was about to experience the horrors that her actions all those years ago had subjected on her parents, when she and her brother had gone missing. Had it come rebounding as some kind of spiritual payback? She certainly hoped not. As Alice wanders across the meadow, all of a sudden she sees Poppy's doll, lying precariously on the trail that leads directly into the woodgrove. She feels her heckles begin to rise. Poppy went everywhere with that doll. She runs to retrieve the doll, surprised to find that its legs and arms have been pulled out and scattered all over the long grass, and she is very perplexed by this discovery. Why would her daughter do this to her beloved doll? Poppy loved this doll. It didn't make any sense. Had she got into an altercation with her brother, and out of spite Digby had torn her doll apart? But then why would he do that? It was not like him. He was a good, very well-behaved boy. She had warned her children that they couldn't play around in the woodgrove unsupervised, so the fact that they had clearly not listened to her, and actually disobeyed, given the location of the doll, made her very indignant indeed. Digby's account. I was 8 years old at the time, and me and my sister were sitting on the kitchen step of our ranch-style farmhouse. We were removing peas from their pods and eating quite a few while we were at it, as they were sweet and rather crunchy. My sister Poppy is sitting with her doll on her lap. She loves this doll, over and above all the other toys that she owns, and has had it since she was 3 years old. I'm going to teach my dolly how to pod peas so she can be a very good mummy one day, she tells me proudly. I thought it was pathetic the way my sister treated her doll, as if it was a real baby. But I knew better than to tease her about it. I realised that girls could be quite silly, really, as they had this irrational obsession with dolls that I could not understand. I'd seen it with my sister's friends, and boy, I was glad not to be born a girl. Boys had so much more fun, didn't they? With water pistols, plastic revolvers, remote control aeroplanes, and so much more exciting the world was for a boy. I hoped one day to follow in my father's footsteps, as I figured he had the best job in the entire world. I could never have envisaged a life stuck behind a computer screen in a boring pedestrian office, with my body becoming cramped from sitting at a desk all day in the same position, drinking dozens of coffees just to keep awake so that my eyes didn't glaze over with boredom from counting figures. Me and my sister Poppy weren't saying much as we shelled the peas. Neither of us were big talkers. We were more the listening, observing type of kids, with slightly reserved natures. I think we inherited those characteristics from my shy, retiring father, as he doesn't talk much either, and for us to sit in silence just watching the world go by is a very comfortable place for us to be. I noticed Poppy had stopped shelling peas, and she was staring directly towards the woods. I look up to follow the direction of her gaze, as her expression appears to be mesmerised. That's when I see it, and my blood runs cold. I observe this hideous creature standing only 100 feet away from us, and the only way I can describe him to you is that he looked demoniacal, like something out of a horror movie. This towering beast was over 7 foot tall, with a very skinny, narrow waist, overlong arms with hands that had dog-like claws attached to the nail bed, and the creature had the head of a wolf. In truth, it looked to be half man and half wolf, standing up on 2 feet. I am so stunned by what I'm observing that my mouth drops wide open into a gawk, and quite suddenly I stop shelling peas. I stared at this thing. The cocky creature was indicating for us to follow him. It was actually beckoning to us with its clawed hands, grinning at us with its canine teeth. I was so frightened by this thing, and so was my sister Poppy. But we didn't react in the way you would have expected us to. Something rather bizarre happened, which all these years later I can't actually comprehend. I felt my name being called in my head. Digby, Digby, Digby. I find myself obediently walking towards the creature like a lamb to the slaughter. All the while the creature's eyes were locked on both me and my sister Poppy, never leaving our gaze for a single second. It was like our minds were not faithfully cooperating with us, as one part of my brain was telling me to run away, but another part of myself obstinately refused to obey my internal commands and kept moving steadily towards the creature. There was something about those treacherous red eyes that ensnared us. It was like we were locked in some kind of hypnotic trance, rather like a fish being caught in a deep-sea fisherman's net, and the more you wrestle against the net, the more entangled you actually become. It felt exactly like that for us. We were wrestling against the hypnotic hold of this creature that it had over us, and try as we might to escape its grasp, it simply refused to release its hold on us. I'm not even sure exactly what I was thinking at the time, for it almost felt as if the experience was dreamlike, surreal, as if it was happening in my imagination, and not really happening to me. This idiosyncratic, malevolent creature continues to beckon to us. Its jaws are drooling. Its smile is so menacing, but its red eyes remain fixed. I keep hearing my name again and again in my head. Digby, Digby. While at the same time Poppy hears her name being called. Poppy, Poppy, Poppy. It is when we're in the woods, with the creature indicating for us to follow him, that something even more sensationally bizarre begins to happen. It's like we've opened a Pandora's box of strange events, one leading directly into another, quite by chance, as if we have somehow slipped into a parallel universe, or a different reality, if you like. We hear the strange grunting sound, then two hefty, robust things come thundering through the woods like an unexpected gale-force wind. I can hear tree limbs breaking and snapping. The ground vibrates and heaves. Whatever is moving towards us is incredibly big. It sounds like an elephant or a rhino in the brush. In a trice, a male and female Bigfoot literally bound through the trees at an unfathomable speed, even taking this wolf-like creature off guard himself. The creature whose eyes have been fixed on us all the time to such an extent that he's even walked backwards to maintain the hold. He drops his gaze from us for a moment to observe the Bigfoots, and on seeing them, he lets out the most hideous growl that gives me the chills. I've never ever heard a growl like that before. It really was awful. It's in that moment that the trance-like lock he had over us is released, as his gaze slips away. Suddenly we become aware of the environment and the perilous danger we are actually in. But we're too disorientated and confused to actually react. A little like after you've climbed off a roller coaster and you've been jolted around so much like the dizzy sweeties in a candy tube. It's almost impossible to gather your thoughts together or to steady yourself on the ground, as everything is still going around and around in your head in circles as if you're still spinning. It takes a long while to actually adjust. The female Bigfoot is about 8 foot tall, but she had the eyes of an angel, and I'm not joking either. She moves gracefully forwards, grabbing us swiftly but gently, throwing us on her shoulder, a little like 2 small sacks of sugar, me on her left-hand shoulder and Poppy on her right. I wasn't afraid when she did this, as I knew she was rescuing us from the evil beast. The relief I felt was immense, as all I wanted more than anything else in the entire world was to get away from that werewolf-like beast, back to the safety of my home. The female Bigfoot takes us behind a very large tree to hide, indicating for us both to remain very quiet. We can hear this awful big scrapple and racket going on, with a great deal of growling, grunting, stamping, snarling, baying and barking. It sounds like the Bigfoot and wolf-like humanoid are fighting together aggressively. Then the male Bigfoot returns. He seems to know exactly where we were hiding,
I noticed he had a huge, nasty, bleeding gash on one of his arms, but he's not bothered about it at all. The female Bigfoot examines it and shakes her head indignantly. The two creatures engage in a lengthy conversation together, in a dialect and language I have never heard before. They speak fast, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, barely stopping to draw breath. Even though I didn't comprehend the alien language they were speaking, it was as if they were saying, "That creature is becoming a big problem. We need to take him out." I knew the male Bigfoot had scared the creature away, as he was much bigger and more intimidating than the wolf-like creature, that was for sure, and was easily 9 foot tall and possibly 800 pounds, whereas the wolf-like creature was only 7 foot tall and possibly 500 pounds by contrast, so the Bigfoot definitely had the edge. There was no doubt about that. The female Bigfoot protectively and lovingly cradles us both in her arms. She is so magnanimously affectionate towards us that we naturally warm to her. It is as if we'd known her all our lives. I remember me and my sister were so relieved to be held tightly to her chest. She had one hand behind each of our heads, and she is rocking us backwards and forwards like a mother does to calm down her frightened children, holding us tightly to her chest. All the while she continues to talk to the male at length, and her voice is stern and deadly serious like a mother who is grievously troubled. At the time we didn't know they were Bigfoot. We saw them as giant humans wearing a ton of hair. She had a maternal, nurturing energy, and I remember in her arms I felt so safe, so protected, so loved. I knew we were going to be all right, but I still soaked her chest with tears, as did my sister. But neither of us cried out loudly, as even our tears were always shed privately. I remember she smelt so woody, so earthy. I've never ever smelt that smell since. But just like a freshly mown lawn might bring on nostalgic, wistful memories to some, so would her smell, if I ever had the privilege to smell it again. I would acquaint her smell with safety, security, and love, and I would certainly appreciate smelling it again. That was when I hear my mother calling out our names. But we remain steadfastly by the Bigfoot's side, until she gives us an encouraging nudge, and I hear the words in my head, "It's safe to go now. Go to your mother." And we did. "Where the hell have you been?" says my mother, lashing out at us so angrily. I've never ever seen her so heated. Her skin had flushed to a deep shade of crimson. She looked grievously upset. She grabs us by the hand on either side of her waist and begins to stomp out of the woods belligerently, pushing us ever forward, while the two Bigfoot surreptitiously watch us leave. My mother was blindly oblivious to their presence, and was so caught up in her indignation that I'm quite sure that even if the Bigfoots had been standing close to her, she'd possibly never have even noticed them. I could see our disappearance had given her the fright of her life. But it was hardly our fault, was it? But then try telling that to my mother. There was certainly no reasoning with her, as she seemed to think we'd deliberately been insubordinate. And as the older, I got the blame, as is usually the case, as I was expected to be responsible and a positive role model to my sister Poppy. "You think it's all right to go and play hide and seek in the wood grove, do you? Did I not specifically say you were to shell those peas, not to go wandering off? If you think what you did was funny, think again. It wasn't. Do I look like I'm laughing? You both gave me the scare of my life. Now what have you got to say for yourself, young man?" my mother says, once we're in the kitchen together. "Why did you take Poppy into the wood grove? You're the eldest son. You know you should be more responsible. What were you thinking? How many times have I told you that there are wild animals in those woods? You'd do well to remember that. And furthermore, Digby, why did you pull out the legs and arms out of Poppy's doll? That was a vindictive, nasty thing for you to do." "It wasn't our fault, Mummy. The wolf man made us go into the woods, but the very nice hairy lady helped us," says Poppy earnestly. "Digby didn't do that to my doll. That wolf thing did it when I dropped it. He thought it was funny. He was horrible, Mummy, and he had big, ugly yellow teeth that were really sharp, and he smelt very, very nasty." "It's true, Mummy. There was a wolf man. He made us go into the woods, but the hairy lady rescued us. I think he was going to hurt us, Mum. He was scary. He made us follow him with his eyes. His eyes made us do what we didn't want to do.
His eyes are like strong hands. They pull you. If you're going to make up pork pies like this, you could do better than that, Digby. If you want to become a liar, you're going to have to be a little bit more credible than that. Would you stop talking nonsense, kids? Your imaginations are all over the place. I blame your father for reading you those fairy tales. I'm not going to tell your father about this. I don't want to upset him. But you promise me you'll not go into that wood grove again. Me and my sister nod. I knew telling her about what had transpired would be completely futile. It was clear she was not going to believe a single word we had to say. Even at such a young, tender age, we were so much more accepting of the idiosyncratic and outlandish. Me and my sister knew that what happened to us was bizarre, and neither of us could make sense of it. But as we were children, we bounced back with that childlike resilience and thought nothing further of it. Only it was good to be back in the safe confines of our farmhouse.
Farmer Wallace's account. Over the last couple of weeks, I had discovered a new uncharted side of my character that had clandestinely laid buried or quiescently dormant for years. It burst forward in my life like a tenacious weed when I was boiling with an unsuppressed lugubrious anger that I had tried desperately to contain. I didn't quite warm to this unprecedented, idiosyncratic, undiscovered part of myself, you could say, that I wasn't well acquainted with. Ostensibly, I'd never been a volatile man, given to capriciously angry or turbulent, belligerent outbursts. You could say most of my life I'd been like a steady, calm, serene ocean, without a ripple to be seen on the water, nor a dark cloud noticed on the distant horizon.
My temper was consistently harmonious, but ever since my poor steer was attacked, it was almost as if an obscure door within me had inadvertently come off its hinges and was impossible to fix until he found a strong enough clasp to secure it together again. I noticed that all my steers, my dog and my family had seen a distinct change in me, and having never been exposed to such an arbitrary side of my character before, it was like they were viewing me with a rising level of trepidation and uncertainty, and even my wife had become wary of me of late, as if she had somewhat resigned herself to walking on eggshells for a while. The whole bodeful event began when I was woken to the sounds of my cattle mooing. They were making quite a commotion one night. They were grazing in a meadow close to the farmhouse, and I sat up with a start in my bed, knowing something was seriously wrong. I work with my steers every day of my life judiciously, managing the affairs of our ranch. I am familiar and very well acquainted with their behaviour. They are normally quite placid, inquisitive creatures with an easy-going disposition, taking life well in their stride. But on this inauspicious night, they were mooing a great deal more than usual. But there was an edge to those moos or bellows that I had never heard before, almost like a silent, frantic cry for help. A call that I heard because I can tune in to their frequency quite easily. My heart was pounding violently in my chest as I quickly threw on my jeans and boots. I hastily scurried out the kitchen door, closing it quietly behind me, with the rifle in my hands and a torch on my head. My dog Jasper was faithfully following behind me, until his sensory receptors were alerted to something noxiously foul on the wind that his nose did not appreciate, so he refused to go any further. I left him whimpering beside the farmhouse, far from happy to have been abandoned by me. I'd never seen him so consumed by such a vacillating reluctance that was so profound it left him almost tethered to the farmhouse. For me, his obsequious, incongruous behaviour was an arbitrary warning sign for me to pay attention. Something was out there that had seriously sucked out my dog's exuberant enthusiasm. The motion-activated lights of our farmhouse were on, but in the meadow the moonlight was dim, obscured by a thick veil of foggy mist, so that even the stars had become like dull coins in the sky that had lost their lustre. I was somewhat bewildered to find all my steers gathered together rather tightly, like a cluster of grapes, much closer than they usually would be, and they appeared to be very afraid. Something was clearly irking them. In a trice, randomly appearing from behind a tree, I see one of my steers, whom had inadvertently become separated from the others, diving into the middle of the herd, where he assumed a safe position, as far away from the outer fringes of the herd as he could get. Let's just say at this point I hadn't observed that this was my injured bullock. I walk around the meadow rather patiently, holding a rifle in my hand, staring at the obscure silhouettes of the trees. The weather is pleasantly warm. There's a still, gentle breeze blowing, but it's very dark. And all the vegetation on our farm, the trees, the plants, anything you could say with a solid density, is locked in a tenebrous oblivion, so I'm not getting to see very much, nor have I heard a thing. I'm used to hearing the nightly chorus of crickets and frogs and their happy, pleasing trills being lifted up into the air, along with the occasional howl from a coyote or a hoot from an owl. But on this night it is so uncommonly quiet, apart from the anguished moos of my bullocks. And this quietness, well, it's not natural. It's as if even the subdued night knows that what is lurking within its mist is far from favourable. I have the most god-awful chill running down the back of my spine. I have an overwhelming sense that I am not alone, that I am being watched. The feeling is so discomposing, so unsettling, so disturbing. It sends a chaotic churning feeling in my gut that feels as if all my insides are being tied up together into hundreds and hundreds of knots. I pull out the slender torch from my jeans pocket that is very bright, and I plunder its brightness over the trees and over the meadow. And that is when I see a pair of red eyes, about 7 feet off the ground, staring at me. But the moment I've seen those eyes, they're suddenly gone. I fire my rifle in the direction of whatever this thing is, but it's gone. My shots bounce into the night with an ear-piercing, whipping, cracking sound. Whatever it was exceedingly big, and I was instinctively convinced that it was somehow connected to scaring my steers half to death. But as to what this ambiguous thing was, I could not imagine. It was the next morning I was to discover one of my steers had been badly scratched, and let's just say it provoked within me an anger that just bubbled to the surface because I felt I was fighting an invisible foe, and that is a very helpless feeling indeed. One day when my wife was grocery shopping in town and my children were at school, I received a visitor to my farm. My face lit up immediately when I saw Lydia Henderson climbing out of her truck, as I knew exactly what she was doing here, and I'd almost been expecting a visit from her. She was every part the quintessential Colorado cowgirl, wearing jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat. She's also a rancher on her husband's farm, and is good friends with my wife. But it was not my wife she'd come to visit, it was me. And by the looks of the expression on her face, she had something rather pressing on her mind. And I thought I knew what it was. "Howdy, Wallace. How's it going with you?" she asks me, giving me a bright twinkling smile. "Good to see you. Dr. Kruger told me about your steer being scratched up. Mind if I see the damage? I'm very interested, you see, if it's similar to what happened to our steer." I knew this was why she was here. It would seem that I was not alone in the heaped level of frustration I felt about the ambiguous predator in our midst. "Please come this way," I say, leading her through the meadow towards my large herd of bullocks. "You have a very impressive herd here, Wallace. They're all in great condition. Wait until you see Mr. Butterfield and his very interesting scar. I'm very glad to tell you he's getting much better. He's also calmed down significantly. He was really scared for a while. Really, you know, rather nervous, you could say." "You name your steers?" she asks, raising a brow and letting out a light laugh that rolls off her tongue. "No, I don't. But he earned a name, didn't he? After what he went through, poor thing." "Careful you don't get too attached," she teases. "I'm always attached to my steers. What do you mean by that? They're all very important to me, you know." Lydia runs her hand down the angry scar on the side of my steer. "Oh, this is nasty, very nasty," she says, grimacing. "It's exactly the same kind of scar that I've got on my steer. And no question of a doubt, the same animal has attacked him." She let out a loud sigh. "Oh, I wish to God we could kill the bugger." "Would you like a coffee, Lydia? I assure you it's no problem at all. I was even going to put one on for myself anyway."
Now you're speaking my language, Wallace. That would be absolutely great. I fancy a cup. Lydia sits down on one of the chairs at our kitchen table. She removes her cowboy hat and runs her hand through her mane of blonde curls to revitalise them. I notice that her hair, like mine, gets considerably flattened by her hat. I notice she's playing with her fingers awkwardly, giving me the sense that she wants to say something, and is deliberately withholding it, as if wondering whether it's a good idea or not. It's a lovely kitchen you've got here, Wallace. I know she's stalling, as Lydia has about as much interest in a kitchen than I do in learning how to make a chocolate cake. She's a woman who's born to embrace the outdoors, and the design of a kitchen has about as much interest to her as watching paint dry. She watches me perform my magic on the coffee machine. I like it, she says. It's very rustic. It's got a traditional farmhouse feel about it, with a modern twist. Like old meeting new, if you know what I mean. It's Alice for you. She's quite a traditional girl, really. Enjoys many of the old ways. She even makes her own butter, you know. You're kidding me. How does she do that? How does anyone do that? She whips the cream to a state when it begins to separate, and then it becomes butter. It's very good stuff, too, after the salt is actually added. Would you like froth on your milk, Lydia? Of course. What do you take me for, Wallace? She laughs. I may be a cowgirl, but I like my frills, and I like my coffee frothy. Very frothy. Sugar? Oh, no, I'm sweet enough, but I wouldn't say no to a spoon of honey if you've got one going. I think we can help there, I say, passing her a jar of honey and a spoon, and then I hand her the coffee and sit down opposite her with my coffee, watching her spoon the honey into her cup. She holds the mug in both her hands as if warming them up, and then takes a reassuring sip. You do make a good cup of coffee, Wallace. I'll give you that. Remind me to visit you more often for a tete-a-tete. I could get used to this. It's the coffee machine, not me. It's espresso di Valetti. Well, that's what I believe it's called, although I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. It's a deep, rich coffee, great served with frothy milk. I pause for a moment, because I'm not exactly the most gregarious, chatty person, but I know that Lydia is keeping something from me, and I want to know exactly what it is. Lydia, I hope this is not presumptuous of me, but I sense you want to tell me something, but you're reluctantly holding back. Please don't. If you do know something about the predator that attacked our steers, I would sure like to know all about it. But would you really, Wallace? She says, raising a questionable brow. Sometimes it's best not to know your enemy. Are you kidding, Lydia? That's where I heartily disagree with you, I have to say. It helps when you know exactly what you are fighting. It's in the not knowing that is the most perilously dangerous. I can assure you of that. That's why in World War II, getting intelligent information from that Enigma machine meant that they were able to decipher, translate, and interpret the contents of the enemy's messages. It was crucial for the success of the war effort, you know. They needed to know the enemy's plans in order to win the war. The dangerous thing is always the not knowing your enemy. It is the element of surprise that has won many wars. Think about the Trojan horse and all the soldiers hidden within it. I mean, what do they say? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, so you are always in the know. Nothing catches you off guard, as your eyes are on the dodgy ball that you don't trust, and you watch those balls like a hawk, never missing a beat. Very well put, Wallace. You're not just a handsome face. You're absolutely right. But there is a quintessentially rather big problem here, in the knowing, that is, that I have to impart to you. And what is that problem? That you may not believe me. My husband is a doubting Thomas, and he's certainly doubting my account. He keeps sweeping me with doubt, you know. Are you sure, Lydia? Maybe you imagined it, Lydia. You can't be right, Lydia. You know, that kind of thing. But I know, Wallace. I know what I saw. Well, I'm open-minded enough to give your story the benefit of the doubt. Why don't you try me? I confess I saw something in the woodgrove 7 feet off the ground, with red eyes glowing at me. So something was definitely out there. Oh, my God!
You saw it! Why didn't you tell me? She says, cupping her hands over her mouth in astonishment. I've been sitting here stewing in my own juices, wondering if I should tell you. And all along you've actually seen it. Maybe you can tell that husband of mine that I'm not actually losing my mind. To be fair, Lydia, I didn't actually see it. I mean, it could have been anything, couldn't it? I saw it 1 second. It was gone the next. But I did shoot at it, I'll tell you that. But what would have red eyes 7 feet off the ground, Wallace? Tell me that. What could you have seen? There are no natural animals out there that tall, with the exception, of course, of a bear standing on its hind legs. And to be fair, a black bear on his hind legs is approximately 7 foot tall. But a grizzly bear, let's think for a moment. Yes, a grizzly bear on his hind legs would be approximately 8 to 10 foot tall. But then again, they've been locally extinct here in Colorado since 1951. So the only other animal that tall could only be a black bear on its hind legs. But this was no black bear. Besides, their eyeshine is like a yellowish colour, isn't it? Well, that's when you shine a light on them. But this thing had red eyes. Nasty, vindictive, evil-looking red eyes. Eyes you can't forget in a hurry. You tell me then what you think you saw. That's the problem. I wish I bloody knew, Wallace. But I can't get the horrifying, haunting image out of my head. Put it this way, you can't unsee a creature like that. Well, describe it to me. Well, I'm a light sleeper, you see. That husband of mine can sleep through a tsunami and a hailstorm and wouldn't be woken up at all. Believe me, if there's anything going on at the ranch during the night, my husband will be the last to know about it. She pauses for a moment, tapping her short pink fingernails against the warm mug. I'm also an instinctive person, always have been. I woke up in the middle of the night by an instinct rather than a noise. Our very large cattle herd was in a pasture quite a way away from the farmhouse. They like to hang around the trees there, sticking together, you know. They're protective like that. I nod. You mean your instincts concern the bullocks? I ask, looking nonplussed. Are you really that in tune with them? Yes, I am in tune, but not so much the bullocks. I just get a sense when something was off. You see, I'm a rancher, so if anything doesn't feel exactly right, the first thing I do, as naturally as brushing my teeth in the morning, is to check on the herd. Over and above everything else, I check on the herd. You see, I trust my instincts, and when something is not right, I just know it in here, she says, pointing to her gut. I wasted no time. I quickly got dressed and hurried towards the meadow with my rifle. I swear to you, Wallace, it was dead out there. And I mean dead. Really dead. It was so quiet. You couldn't have heard a sound. But as I got closer to the steers, they were making the weirdest bellowing low-frequency noise, unlike anything I've ever heard before. It was very unsettling. I could feel those steers were frightened. I've never seen them behave like that before, and they were all looking at one specific spot, so I quickly followed their gaze. You're recounting almost word for word exactly what happened to me, I reflect. My herd was making a very strange low-pitched mooing sound, I have to say. Actually, the word you use is much more appropriate. Bellow is better. Or even braying or brawling would be a much more appropriate description. That was when I saw it, Wallace. It was standing there, this grotesque, macabre creature. It turned around and looked directly at me. But I chose not to look into its eyes. Something warned me not to look into those eyes. I don't know why, but I just got this feeling that if I did, I'd live to regret it. But this thing was hideously ugly, vile-looking. The moonlight was excellent that night, which was a dreadful pity. And along with the light of my torch, I hasten to say I was not spared the indignity of seeing this hideous creature in all its glory. I swear to you, Wallace, it was enjoying my shocked revulsion and abhorrent horror. It perceived I was appalled in seeing something as ghastly as he was. It was wallowing in my fear, basking in it, if you like. You know, I don't even know if this thing was actually intent on willfully harming our steers. I think it wanted to frighten the hell out of them,
like some warped, insidious nightly entertainment it was having at their expense.
Wallace, I promise you, this thing was having so much fun. He was having the time of his life. I know it sounds crazy, I know it sounds nonsensical, but I promise you it was actually laughing. And I'm not kidding either. And when he saw me, I think I became the cherry on his birthday cake, something else he could actually terrorise. And he took a great deal of delight in doing just that. This thing was menacious, vindictive, nasty, and malevolent to its very core.
So you don't think it wanted to harm the steers?
For a start, if he really wanted to kill that steer, the one that he scratched up, I doubt it would have been a problem for him. Whatever this thing is, granted it scratched the steers, but I believe it just wanted to do that to engender fear in the herd. It gets off in scaring the living daylights out of you. It enjoys terrorising animals and people. My guess is it probably feeds on much smaller prey, like raccoons or squirrels. So I'm not worried about this thing killing our herd. I'm worried about the stress he's causing to them. That's my huge issue, because we all know stress can kill, and kill badly too.
So what did this thing actually look like?
It looks like something you'd expect to find in hell, like a demon should look. Although this thing was not supernatural, it was real like you or me. It had the body of a human being, the head of a wolf. And I know this sounds warped and far-fetched and fanciful, but it had 2 rows of teeth. I'd say the head was much larger than your average wolf. Put 2 or 3 of those heads together, maybe 4, to make one head. I noticed the creature was thin, muscular. It had broad shoulders covered with dense, thick, dark hair. And I noticed there was all this blood all over its mouth. He was the most hideous thing I have ever seen. At a guess, I'd say he was about 7 foot tall, maybe 500 pounds, possibly more. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he had a very large tail like a wolf or German shepherd. Exactly like that, only infinitely bigger.
What did you do?
Well, you know, Wallace, I was frozen to the spot. A while ago, my cat brought in a baby rabbit from the meadow, and I wondered why the hell this little rabbit wouldn't run away. Even when I let it out, releasing him from my cat's clutches, it remained frozen for quite a while, shaking, until it suddenly realised it was free, and then it bounced away. And I remember thinking that was odd behaviour. I would have thought it would run away at once, immediately. But now I know, Wallace. Now I know what it's like to feel so much fear that your body becomes catatonic, and it even paralyses your natural adrenal and cortisol reactions, which become incapacitated and non-responsive. That was me all over.
Bloody hell! That's not good. You must have been freaking out.
I was, but it was like this long, distant voice at the back of my head that seemed to be calling me from a long way away. It sounded like my mother's voice, very familiar. And get this, she's been dead for 10 years. I heard her voice saying, "Run, Lids! Run, Lids!" She's the only person who ever called me Lids in life. It kind of caught on when I was little, because my parents complained tirelessly that I had this annoying habit of never putting the lids back onto jars and tubs. Anyway, that helped me snap out of my stunned stupor, and I fired after this creature with my rifle. But Wallace, this thing could run, and none of my bullets got him. I hasten to say, I'm an excellent shot too. Lydia looks at me through earnest round blue eyes. You do believe my story, Wallace, do you not?
I do, I say solemnly. I do. It fits the bill of what is attacking our steers. And I'm of the opinion there are things out there that can't always be explained. The question is, Lydia, what are we going to do about this thing? Even if it isn't intent on killing our livestock, it wants to cause them immeasurable stress. What are we going to do? Do you know I heard this true story once? A man was locked in a freezer that was not actually on, but it was cold in that unit, so he falsely believed he would freeze to death, and the stress caused him to have a heart attack. The worst part of it all was that the freezer unit wasn't locked, and even if he had slept in it all night, it would have been fine. It wouldn't have killed him. But the accumulative stress about the impending doom he faced caused him to have a grievous heart attack and subsequently die.
That's stress for you. Stress is very unkind. Bloody hell, that's a terrible story. We have to kill this creature, Wallace. Somehow we need to take this creature down. Both our ranches have been harassed by this god-awful thing. It seems to be adverse to our trail cameras, so my suggestion is you take yours down one night. And on that night in question, keep patrolling the meadows every 20 minutes or so, as clandestinely as you can, as you want to catch this thing off guard, so it's not expecting you. You can't let him know you're there. I'll do it the following night after you. Put your trail cameras back after that. We can alternate on this approach, so we can get some sleep on alternative nights. How good of a shot are you with your rifle? Quite good, actually. Well, that's a good start. All I can say is don't focus on the creature, Wallace. Just shoot it straight away. Don't give it the opportunity to play any mind games with you, because believe you me, it will. This thing is sharp, it's clever, it's intelligent, and don't you dare look into those eyes. Those eyes of his have got some kind of power. I'm not sure what it is, but you can't afford to look in his eyes. I'll tell you what, I'll do it tonight. This afternoon I'm going to take all my trail cameras down, and I'll go out patrolling every 20 minutes like you suggest. We've got to get this thing. The trail cameras have been a deterrent, but eventually that creature will figure them out. Great, you do tonight, and let me know if you have any luck. Believe me, you're going to need lots of it. That afternoon I took down the trail cameras that I'd erected around the trees and fences overlooking the pastures where the animals grazed. That evening, after my wife had gone to bed, I told her I was staying up to watch sports on television. This is something I never normally do. I gave our dog Jasper 2 antihistamines that are powerful sedatives to ensure he slept deeply, as I didn't want him to be alerted to my nightly adventure, if you can call it that. My wife was more than a little perturbed, as she knew how physically exhausted I am as a cattle rancher, and so for me to be remaining up did make her raise a questionable eyebrow. You sure you're all right, sweetheart? It's not like you to not want to come to bed all of a sudden. I really want to see this boxing match, I lied to her. Until then, I'd never expressed much of an interest in boxing at all. You do surprise me. Since when have you been interested in boxing? She asked gingerly, giving me a scathing look. I just heard this boxer. Well, he's got very good moves, I believe. What's his name? I can't remember. I think it's Tyson Fury. That's right, it's Tyson Fury. My wife doesn't look very convinced, but luckily she doesn't ask me any more awkward questions. I really don't want her to know about the creature Lydia Henderson encountered. It would cause her no end of worry. That night things seemed so prevailingly ordinary. Nothing about the night possessed any sense of foreboding, and I really began to feel as if my regular 20-minute patrols were completely fruitless. I was glad this was not my personal job. Truly, I have great sympathy for anyone who works night shift or is on guard duty. My eyelids were becoming droopy and heavy, and I was becoming increasingly fatigued. It was almost impossible to keep my eyes open, but I was exceedingly determined to see this through. It was at 2:00 in the morning when everything changed. I went out on my nightly patrol, and the silence was muzzled, its ominous stillness alerting me to the fact that our evil nighttime visitor had returned. It seemed removing the trail cameras had invited him right back onto the premises with open arms, to subject my bullocks to his hunger games. But the air was polluted with a stench of rotting flesh. There wasn't a sound, not a cricket or frog to be heard, not a distant call of a coyote, daring to inject the silence with even a sound. For their tuneful choruses had been censored by the foreboding presence of an iniquitous evil that you could tangibly feel, for it defiled and contaminated the meadow with its dark, insidious energy. All I could hear was my boots clandestinely moving towards the pastures, as discreetly as I possibly could, so that the sounds of my boots had become very loud. I climbed beneath the spaces of the fence and trudged over the dew-covered grass. But then I could hear the bellowing sound of my steers, and that unfamiliar anger bubbled up inside me all over again. I moved skillfully between the trees to take up my silent position. The moonlight was generous, and she needed to be
to help me with this unforgiving task I had at hand. I needed nature to magnanimously assist me in removing this blight from the landscape, this corrupt, vile, treacherous being. It was then that I saw it, and for a brief moment nothing prepared me for what I was beholding. It was like I could not believe what I was actually seeing. As Lydia Henderson had rightly conjectured, there's nothing like this that you can actually prepare for some things you just can't unsee. And believe me, no one would want to feast their eyes on such depravity. The creature was like a demon, half human, half wolf, absolutely gargantuan, covered in dense hair, with human-like hands that wore the nail-like appendages that reminded me of sharp knives. The creature was moving towards my steers, who were clustered so tightly together, their eyes pinned on this horrifying beast that appeared to be laughing at them. I knew Lydia was right. The creature was not in my meadow to attack one of my bullocks for an easy meal. Not at all. No, not at all. He was here for some nightly entertainment. He was here to enjoy himself. It brought him great excitement to subject my bullocks to a paralysing fear. He seemed to thoroughly enjoy doing that. My hands were shaking on the trigger of my rifle, I was so angry. I wanted to get a shot without hurting any of my steers, and this was not going to be an easy endeavour. Even the sounds of gunshots would be upsetting for them, and also for my sensitive ears that hated the booming sound of my rifle. Then something remarkable happened that completely caught me off guard. I am hit with the astounding revelation that something else has been quietly stalking this wolf-like humanoid. And there were two of these creatures. They looked like human giants covered in hair with human-like faces, and both fortuitously jumped the wolf-like humanoid so that he fell back on the ground. The creature could not react. He couldn't fight back. All those advanced privileges had been stolen from him, as he had been blindly oblivious to his enemy, the enemy in his midst, that had an advantage over him, and it happened as quickly as swatting a fly. The male Bigfoot began to stamp the creature's head underneath his foot so that it broke like an egg, and it was over for him. The wolf-like being literally was gone. All this happened so quickly, and even my steers moved forward to gather around the dead wolf-like humanoid to examine the thing that had caused them so much grief. They were relieved to see that it would not be in a position to scare them any more. They didn't seem bothered by the two large hairy humanoids that I realised at once were Bigfoots, which made me wonder if my steers were actually familiar with the creatures. The male Bigfoot picked up the wolf-like creature's body, throwing it over his large shoulders, and he and the female Bigfoot began to chat backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. I sensed they were saying, "That was easy," and then they were gone, just like that. I had to rub my eyes in disbelief, like a movie clip that happens so fast you have to rewind it back again and again to make sure that it really happened as you thought it did. But I unequivocally knew that it actually had. Suffice to say, life reverted back to normal for Lydia Henderson's family, and for mine as well. But after learning about my children's account, I knew that those Bigfoot were a big blessing to our lives. So every Christmas and Easter, I leave a basket of goodies out for them in the woodgrove. My way of saying thanks. I'm so glad that they're out there, and they're watching over my farm and over my steers. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Growing up as a little girl in the 1940s, there was no love lost between me and my small family. My father inadvertently blamed me for the abrupt, impetuous, unheralded death of my beloved, very precious mother, although he would never say a thing to me about his true feelings when he was sober, as my father was by nature a soft, gentle, generous spirit, not inclined to be hard-hearted or cold by nature. It would seem in the cold, brutal light of day, he treated me very differently to my older sister, on whom he graciously showered with an abundance of love. My mother had died during childbirth, which was less uncommon in those days as it is now. At the time he had obsequiously begged the doctors to save my mother's life over her baby, which was me. But despite the doctor's very best efforts to accommodate his wishes, in the end I was the one that was unfortunately spared for him.
Sometimes, despite our very best wishes, serendipity can play a role in our lives, and it was not meant to be for my mother. When my father was drunk, he would hurl abuse at me. He didn't mean to, because he wasn't a mean man, but his seemingly unmerciful life had been unfairly discriminatory on him, as he had loved my mother so dearly. So my presence in his life was embittered, an acrid reminder of his dreadful calamitous loss. Let's just say my sister, who was 18 when my mother died, would also be quick to blame me for my mother's gratuitous absence in our lives. Let's just say her cutting, intransigent words were really piercing, as she doggedly, obstinately perceived I was the one who stole her mother away from them by daring to be born, and causing my mother to lose so much blood in the process that it was almost impossible for her to be saved. My sister would say to me, "You're a murderer! You killed Mummy!" And the guilt of what I'd done weighed so heavily on my young heart. I knew I had to be a very bad person. My sister would tell me how wonderful my mother had been in life. So kind, so beautiful, so noble, so devoted. She'd show me unblemished, pristine pictures of this beautiful, graceful-looking woman, with long strawberry blonde hair and bright, sparkling blue eyes, who looked almost celestial, like an angel. I'd see her pictures in leather-bound albums of the three of them together, looking every part the happy family. It would grieve my heart that I'd woefully managed to tear them apart. I knew that I was like that unsightly mole that pops out on your skin unexpectedly, that no one wants and would like very much to cut out. I could see a sparkle in my father's eyes back then in those old photographs that no longer existed today. It was as if that joyful look and my father's heart belonged back to a time when life had been graciously good to him. Not any more. I wanted more than anything in the world for my father to be happy, like he was in those photographs, because I loved him with all my heart. And I was the reason my dad would bask in his melancholia. I never saw him smile, not once, and I knew with every part of my being, that this was because of me, and that made me feel very sad indeed.
"Mummy and Daddy never wanted you," my sister would say. "They discussed the fact that they didn't want to have any more children. They didn't plan for you like they planned for me. I was an only child. When you were born, I was 18 years old. They didn't want any more children. It was 3 of us against the world, until you came along. You were a mistake, a faux pas, that's what they say. When Mum was pregnant with you, she cried ruefully for days and days on end. I remember her saying that she wished with all her heart she wasn't pregnant. She didn't want any more children. But no, you were audaciously determined to come along, come what may, and ruin everything for us. And now she's dead because of you. And Dad is always sad." If my father overheard my sister talking to me like that, with such an obvious heartless disdain, he would chastise her. "There's no need to talk to your sister Meredith like that," he would say. "Your mother's death was a tragic accident. It couldn't be helped." But his eyes told a very different story, and failed to disguise the deep pain he felt within his heart. And despite his very best efforts, I knew under the layers, deep down in his gut, he also clandestinely blamed me for her fortuitous death. And I mean, how could I blame him for that? Even at 8 years old, he couldn't hide that look from me. It's amazing how discerningly perceptive you can be when you're young. My sister said my dad used to have black hair, the colour of coal, but in the week of my birth, due to his lugubrious wounded heart, his hair turned grey. My father had 3 prominent eyebrows, one that was on top of his mouth, and the other that framed both of his eyes like a hairy curtain rail. My father's eyes were as blue as the ocean. I loved his eyes, 'cause if they were water, you could swim in them. I hasten to say that there were good times in those early days, in our Tennessee mountain home. Even hurting people have their endearing moments, you know, when they're actually kind and loving. I was to learn later on in life
Hurting people hurt people, and my father was angry with the universe, with God, and of course with me, for we had all played our quintessential roles of depriving him of the love of his life. When my father would drink alcohol, that was when he would say those mean things to me. So I didn't like it when he drank, because the drink made him become horrible. But when he was sober, he was so incredibly kind. My sister was quick to point out that when my father was drunk, his true feelings would emerge, like the white smoke from a chimney. "Go to bed, you little runt," my father would drawl. "You're nothing but a waste of space. If you hadn't been born, I'd have my wife here with me. I wouldn't need to drink like this. Drown my sorrows. You make me drink so that I don't have to feel this dreadful pain. Every time I look at you, I'm reminded of what you've done. Now get out of my sight." I would burst into tears and run up to bed, saturating and soaking my pillows with the downpour of my remorseful regret. If I'd been a cloud, I would have rained on the earth an awful lot, but at least the plants would have benefited from my weeping. My sister would say accusingly to me, "Now look what you've done. You've made Daddy upset. That's why he's drinking." It never occurred to her that I was also upset, but then it would seem my hurt didn't matter to her at all. She was fiercely protective towards my father, which was why she had never left home in the first place. She ran our household, cleaned and cooked, and took care of everything, and I will admit she really was a domestic goddess in every regard, the kind of woman men would dream to have as a wife. I knew if she left home that my father would never manage without her, but by the looks of my sister, she was like a stubborn piece of heavy-duty furniture that had no intentions of going anywhere. Not any time soon, that is. There were times, many of them, that my sister Felicia was very kind to me, gentle, warm-hearted, companionable, and affectionate, telling me how much she loved having me as a sister, when she'd faithfully brush my hair over 100 times and attentively braid it on both sides of my head. She would help me get dressed in those early days, making sure I looked my absolute best, especially on Sundays, and solicitously give me things to do around the house that would make me feel terribly important, like polishing the dresser or helping her bake some chocolate chip cookies that were my daddy's absolute favourite. Sometimes I would walk with her hand in hand to the local town, where she'd buy me 10 cents worth of sweets, and if I was very good, a nice ice cream that cost 7 cents. I would always choose vanilla ice cream dipped in chocolate. So despite everything, my life was remarkably good. But I always grew up with a profound sense that my father and sister would be a great deal happier without me. I knew I was the blight on the landscape that always reminded them of the biggest nightmare in their lives, the loss of my beloved mother that occurred because of a monumental mistake, and that grievous mistake was me. My sister explained to me that some mistakes could never ever be undone. "It's not like dropping stitches when you knit," she told me. "Mummy's dead. She's never coming back. She's in heaven now. She's otherwise engaged." "Is it nice in heaven?" I asked her. "Very nice in heaven," she told me. "The roads there are paved with gold. There are flowers that sing songs for you, and they're dancing rainbows in the sky made out of colours you can't even get here on earth. And God sits there on a golden throne, welcoming everyone into heaven when they arrive. He looks exactly like Father Christmas, with lots and lots of white hair and a bushy beard. And he's a very loving, clever man, older than the world, and he knows all his children very well by name. And he has thousands and thousands of children, as many as the stars that you can see in the sky. And when we go to heaven, our clothes become as bright as those stars. And we never ever get sad there, because there are no tears there, no sadness, no sorrow. There's joy in heaven, and trees dripping with the sweetest fruit you've ever tasted in your life." "Well, then why don't we go there to be with Mummy, and then we can be very happy together? It sounds such a nice place." "It's not like that, silly. You can't just go there when you want to. You have to wait for God to call you first. He has to invite you over. It's like when you get an invitation to a birthday party.
You can't go unless they send you an invitation. Do you understand? I remember thinking God was being selective and very mean, not sending us a personal, private invitation to heaven, and willfully excluding us, just like Alicia Winterbourne, who had refused to send me any invitations to her birthday party because she said I copied her picture in art, because my picture had 2 rainbows, not just one, and so did her picture. But I knew that she had sneakily copied my picture, not the other way round. One night when I was fast asleep in bed, I suddenly woke up to hear my father and sister downstairs talking in the kitchen together. I could hear them mumbling and muttering as if they were deliberately trying to talk quietly together, and wondered to myself why they were up so late. I would have normally pulled the bed cover over my head and continued to sleep, but I promptly decided I was thirsty and needed some milk to quench my thirst, so I crept soundlessly down the staircase. But that was when I heard my name being mentioned. I stood very still, listening in to the conversation intently, my ears perked forward like a dog. I sat on the staircase in my pink pyjamas, wrapping my little arms around my legs close to my chest, to eavesdrop on what they were actually saying. I could tell by the solemn, sombre tones of their voices that what they were discussing was very serious indeed. I wondered in clandestine horror if something quite dreadful had happened. They talked in the same heavyweight, grave kind of voices when Granny Mona had died. I listened carefully, and then I realised that they're discussing me. My sister told me it was bad to talk about people behind their backs. She called it gossiping, but she was gossiping about me to my father, so she was doing the same thing she deemed ugly, and I felt disappointed in her for that. Dad, you know it makes sense. I've seen how sad you've been since Mum died. I am too, you know, and I know every time you look at Meredith, you're reminded of what happened. It's been 8 years, Dad, and the pain still doesn't go away, does it? If anything, it's worse now than ever before. I believe Meredith is entirely responsible for our pain, Dad. When Mum was alive, I will remind you that you didn't drink a drop of alcohol. Never. You never touched the stuff. Mum would be so upset, so disappointed to see you like this, Dad, caught up in such grievous despair, and drinking too much just to drown your sorrows. These days, Dad, you never ever smile. I don't think I've seen you laugh once. It breaks my heart, Dad, to see you like this. It really does. You deserve so much better. You deserve to be happy. I know I shouldn't blame that poor child for the disjointed melancholia I feel. I mean, it's hardly her fault, is it, for what transpired that dreadful night? But I can't help blaming her, resenting her for everything. I know I'm being unreasonably selfish, but I can't help feeling that if she had not been born, none of this would ever have happened, and we would be very happy as we always were together. I know I treat her differently to you. I wish I didn't. I feel very guilty for how hard I can be on her at times. I don't give her all the affection she deserves. I mean, she's only 8 years old, for goodness sake, and I'm a grown man. I should know better. It's like I'm picking on her for no reason at all. But I can't help how I feel. Sometimes I even hate her when I look at her. I'm constantly reminded over and over again about your beautiful, precious mother. How I miss her. I feel aggrieved, so aggrieved with what happened to her. It was all bitterly unfair. And I'm sorry, but God is also responsible for all this. He said in his word we wouldn't have to put up with more than we can bear, but he lied to me about that. How can I respect the good Lord when he does that, I ask you? My life is torturous without my beloved Christine, and I'll never ever be the same again. I thought with time I would come to terms with things, move on with my life, even get remarried at some point. But I can't let go of the hurt. I can't let go of Christine. It's all consuming. It really is.
I feel exactly the same way, Dad. I promise you that. When I look at Meredith, I think of Mummy, and then I feel such indignant anger towards her. I know people would be disgusted if they saw the way we act sometimes, the way we behave towards Meredith. They'd think we were being irrational in our judgment, and they would have a good point about that. I mean, if I was wearing their shoes, I'd feel exactly the same way. But it's so easy to pass judgment, isn't it, when you're looking from the outside in? They haven't been through the mince grinder like we have. I admit, we probably are being unreasonable. We should love her, like we loved Mum, but it's so much easier said than done. That's why, Dad, we've got to do this. Do you understand? We've got to do this. This way we can both heal and move on with our lives. And I think it's in Meredith's best interests as well. I mean, you do want her to be happy, don't you, Dad?
Of course I do, Felicia. Of course I do. I want very much for her to be happy, more than anything in the world. Every parent wants the best for their children. I'm no different. That's why I feel like such a pig favouring you over her. But with you I have so many precious memories spent with your mother, the three of us together as one loving, happy family. And when Meredith came along, it was a full stop to that life, the life I'd always known and loved. Despite everything, I do love her, but I can't seem to show her that. I seem incapable of overcoming my bitterness.
I understand, Dad. I really do get it. I feel exactly the same way. I was telling you that Mr. and Mrs. Araminter both lost their daughter. Same age as Meredith. Very similar looks to Meredith too. Strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes. The little girl drowned in their pond. They're absolutely devastated. Mrs. Araminter cannot have any children of her own. They've been trying for years and years, and nothing has happened. The doctors don't know why she's barren, but it appears she is. Let's just say, Dad, giving Meredith to her as a daughter wouldn't be a formal adoption. It would be an arrangement between us. It would mean that if we wanted to go and visit Meredith, we could, but at least they'd have a child to replace the one they lost, and we would be able to move on with our lives and begin to heal. It's a win-win situation all around, don't you see? You can be assured the Araminters will show her love, lots of it, and Meredith will get the life she really deserves. It's not fair, Dad, the way we treat her. She deserves better. You do show favouritism to me, and it's not right. The Araminters are much wealthier than we are, so I'm sure Meredith will have landed in the clover. She'll have lovely things, and what little girl doesn't appreciate a bit of finery? I've seen the way Meredith looks at those princess clothes in that lovely boutique in town that we could never afford to buy for her. But the Araminters will give her the life of her dreams. They'll be able to serenade her with all this extravagant stuff. She'll have privilege, advantage, and a great education. They'll probably send her to a very expensive school.
You're right. Perhaps this is the answer, and Meredith will be able to make another couple happy. It can't have been easy for them losing a child, as it has not been easy for us losing your mother. Maybe this is a very good decision. It won't be easy for us to let go of your sister, but I think you're right in the long term. It is in our best interests, and of course it's in Meredith's best interests as well.
I remember sitting on the staircase, tears spilling down my cheeks. I could taste the saltiness on my tongue. They were like unwelcome raindrops on a fine sunny day. My father and my sister wanted to get rid of me. Not only did they blame me for my mother's unforeseen death, but they couldn't bear to have me around a moment longer as part of the family. I had come along not only at an inopportune time in their lives, but I had stolen the crown jewel from them, my mother. She was the goose that laid the golden egg. How I wish I had not been responsible for killing her. If she had died some other way, then I wouldn't be blamed for her unpremeditated passing. And maybe then, just maybe then, my father might actually love me. I was 8 years old when Mrs. Araminter came to pick me up at my home, in her black Buick Roadmaster. My sister and father told me I was going to live with a lovely couple for a while.
But I knew that they were secretly offloading me onto someone else, as they did not want me anymore. Both my father and my sister were fighting back tears when they watched me climbing back into the back of the truck, with all my worldly goods packed in one small suitcase. I felt so sorrowful, so sad, so deflated, like an abandoned stray dog on the side of the road that nobody wanted to own. My heart was heavy, but I wondered why my family appeared sad to see me go, because they so desperately wanted to get rid of me, didn't they? So the streaming tears down their faces were incongruous and made no sense to me whatsoever.
Meredith, I want you to be so happy, my sister had told me. I want you to have the most perfect life. If things don't work out for you, you can always come back home. But I'm sure you're going to be incredibly happy in your new home. Mr. and Mrs. Araminta have much more money than we have, and they can give you a much, much better, much more privileged life. You'll go to better schools, you'll have better things. I know I've sometimes snapped at you, Meredith, blamed you for what happened to Mum, and that wasn't fair, and I really apologise profusely for that. I know it wasn't your fault, really. It's just the festering wounds I feel about Mother's loss are very deep, and it's far worse for Daddy. It doesn't help that with your strawberry blonde hair and your blue eyes, you're the splitting image of Mum. So every time Dad sees you, he sees her, and it makes him very angry at times. More with God than with you, of course. When he looks at you, he keeps being reminded of his dreadful loss. So it would be a lot better if you go. Then me and Daddy will feel much better. You want us to feel better, don't you? You want us to feel better about things. I nodded. I do want you to feel better, but I don't want to go. I want to stay with you and Daddy. My father had taken me into his arms, his eyes filling with tears. He had kissed me gently on the forehead and said, "I'm sorry, little Meredith. One day you'll thank me for this. We both want you to be happy, that's all." Mrs. Araminta dutifully led me to the back of her truck, putting me in the passenger seat next to hers. "I think in the circumstances you done the right thing," she told my father. "You know grief can do dreadfully strange things. Believe me, I know. You're helping me and my husband an awful lot get through this dreadful pain of ours. And I hope in turn we're helping you in some way. It's so much better not to get lawyers involved. It's a perfect arrangement between us, and I assure you, we will make your daughter very happy indeed. She won't want for a single thing. I can promise you that." I remember the day I arrived at the Aramintas' farmhouse. I was amazed by how much more impressive it was compared to my little rustic, simplistic mountain home. But despite its grandeur, I hankered after what I knew, what I loved and missed, the simplistic lifestyle of my home. Despite everything, I missed my father and my sister, and wished with all my heart that they had loved me enough to keep me. I didn't fancy moving into the strange house with strangers who were grieving the loss of their daughter and were hoping that I would fill her shoes and iron away their pain like a heavy-duty steam iron, working through the ponderously stout creases in an obstinate garment that is refusing to straighten. Let's just say that this is a heavyweight kind of responsibility to put on an 8-year-old girl. The house was nestled against a backdrop of huge mountains that billowed up gracefully into the sky in an undulating sweep of rugged contours that kissed the white cotton candy clouds with their pointed tips. Beyond the pristinely manicured lawn, framed by a small box hedge, there was a flowery meadow that was dappled with occasional rocky outcrops, and beyond that were vast areas of woodland, where towering oaks and red maple trees gracefully imposed themselves on the landscape like lofty giants. The prepossessing red-bricked home, 6 times the size of our house, very elegantly built. It had high ceilings and large fireplaces, oakwood floors and sweeping staircases, with large windows that overlooked the arresting views of the countryside. It really was a magnificently beautiful home. Of that I cannot dispute. Within days of moving in, I was very uncomfortable in my new environment. Granted, it was thrilling to have a bedroom all of my own, that had been superbly decorated, with no expense spared. The fabulous curtains and duvet covers were wearing a meadow,
The walls were luxuriously papered in pink and covered in fairies. The furniture was white wood. The bed was shaped like a princess carriage with large wheels and a white wrought iron canopy. There was a large white shelf on one end of the bedroom, covered in a marvellous selection of china dolls, wearing opulent, elegant gowns, antique teddy bears, and there was a huge selection of children's books to choose from. I was thrilled to be the owner of so many fabulous, prestigious toys, many with labels from Hamleys in London. Growing up, I only had a rather bedraggled rag doll that looked more like something the cat dragged in. But to be fair, it had belonged to my sister once, and so had definitely seen better days. When I arrived at the house, Mrs. Araminter threw my suitcase and the clothes I was wearing into the dustbin and described them as pitiful rags. Oh dear, these clothes are quite dreadful. They really are. I don't care how little money you have. No little girl should have to dress like this. It's shameful, truly shameful, she said, crying crocodile tears. Well, it looked like that anyway. They belonged to my sister when she was my age, I explained. Well, that explains an awful lot then, doesn't it? Why they're so bedraggled. No child of mine is going to wear second-hand cast-offs. That's not going to happen. We have higher standards in this household. It was funny that she'd said that, as I ended up inheriting all her daughters' second-hand clothes and toys, but then, to be fair, they all looked as if they were brand new, and had been made to measure by an expensive designer, or bought from a very expensive toy store. It's 'cause you're rich, I explained to her. My daddy's not rich like you, I said, feeling the urgent need to defend my father, as despite all his failings, I knew he'd never have begrudged us anything he could afford, but my papa had never had the kind of money that the Araminters obviously had. I just felt she was being mean about my poor papa, who worked very hard to secure a living for us. My dad was a brilliant carpenter, and back then such a skill was not appreciated as much as it is now, so the pay he received was rather pitiful. Mrs. Araminter insisted I wore her dead daughter's clothes, which felt weird to me, as even at 8 years old, I didn't want to wear a dead person's clothes. I will admit the clothes were fit for a princess, as they were very pretty, with a pink trim and jackets made from fake pink fur, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I knew I looked like a princess, and very pretty, for I liked the girl staring back at me, even if her eyes looked really rather sad. She looks just like our Charlotte. The resemblance is remarkable. It's uncanny. I mean, the same strawberry blonde hair, the same sparkling blue eyes. I could hear Mr. Araminter say to his wife, You did very well, sweetheart. But are you sure we can keep her as our very own? The way he was talking, you'd think I was a possession he'd purchased, like another car for his garage, or a pitchfork for his yard shed. What did the family have to say about that? She's ours for good. They know she deserves a good life. But the mother died in childbirth, delivering her into the world. They wanted to save the mother, but the doctors couldn't. Only the child survived. The mother did not. Let's just say it's most unfortunate, but the husband blames the little girl for the wife's fortuitous death. So it's a catch-22 situation, you could say. They think if she's out of sight and out of mind, the little girl, that is, that they might be able to heal. Their emotions are raw, like ours. 8 years on, though. It's too dreadful for words, but it is what it is. Well, their loss is our very fortunate gain. She looks just like our daughter. That's a huge plus. But I doubt she's going to be the same as Charlotte. I want you to realise that, sweetheart. I don't want you to be disappointed. She's likely to have a very different personality, you know. We can make her the same as our daughter, Mrs. Araminter insisted. It won't be too hard. It's like moulding a piece of clay into what you want it to become. It's not too difficult. You wait and see. I'll work miracles on that little girl. I hope you know what you're doing, sweetheart. As I say, I don't want you to be disappointed. I want you to be happy. Mrs. Araminter came into my bedroom. She sat down on my bed next to me to have a chat. She was a woman in her early 30s, who wore meadows on her dresses and tiny white belts around her narrow waist. Her dark hair was curly and short,
but she also wore pretty jewellery in her hair that glittered like a diamond. She was nice to look at when she had a happy face, but I didn't like it when she wore a sad face or a cross face. Then she never looked pretty. When she wore those faces, that is. "You're not Meredith anymore," she told me. "From now on, you're going to be Charlotte, and I want you to call me Mummy, and I want you to call Mr. Araminta Daddy from now on. Do you understand?" "But my name isn't Charlotte. My name is Meredith. I don't want to be called Charlotte. I like my old name." "Not anymore. You're Charlotte from now on," says Mrs. Araminta fiercely. "This is your bedroom, and we are your mummy and daddy. Do you understand? Your real daddy doesn't want you anymore, so we are your new parents from now on." "Yes, ma'am." "No, Charlotte, not ma'am. What did I say?" "Yes, mummy." "Good girl. Now come down to dinner. I've cooked your favourite." I was stunned, because how did Mrs. Araminta know what my favourite meal was? Had she spoken to my sister or my father? I was soon to realise that Mrs. Araminta's daughter, who died, was called Charlotte, and her favourite meal was chicken pot pie. While it was very good and it filled my tummy nicely, it wasn't my favourite meal. I liked buttered scones, gravy and mashed potatoes. But when I told my new mother this, she became indignant. She wore her sad face and piped, "Chicken pot pie is your favourite meal, Charlotte, and that's final. Do you understand?" I nodded dutifully, but I didn't understand why she was telling me what my favourite food was, as I knew what I liked best. She didn't know what I liked. At night, Mrs. Araminta would read me Charlotte's favourite books and tuck me into bed with Charlotte's teddy bear. "You don't want to go to bed without Mr. Scotty, do you?" my new mother would say. "Mr. Scotty will be offended if you abandon him like this. You know he's your favourite toy. For years you have not wanted to go to bed without Mr. Scotty. You slept with him since you were 3 years old." I wanted to protest quite adamantly, as I'd never slept with Scotty a day in my life before I came to live in their home, but I didn't want my new mother to wear her sad face, so I nodded in agreement. In truth, I didn't like Mr. Scotty at all. I thought the teddy bear was absolutely horrid. He wore a tartan jacket with gold buttons down the middle, and had oversized eyes that took up most of his face, that made him look like he was glaring at me. I liked to go to bed with Miranda, the doll. She was pretty with curly black hair and blue eyes. When my mother wasn't looking, I would replace Scotty for Miranda and fling the teddy bear on the floor. On one occasion, when my new mother found Mr. Scotty lying in a sorry heap with his face against the floor, underneath a puddle of my dirty clothes, she grabbed the teddy from the floor, her face growing crimson with indignation, her nostrils flaring. She moved towards me and slapped me on the cheek. She was so mad. "Charlotte, Mr. Scotty is your favourite toy. You're treating him with disrespect and contempt. What do you have to say for yourself, leaving him on the floor like this under your clothes? It's not acceptable. It's abysmal behaviour." "He's not my favourite toy," I insisted. "I like Miranda best. Miranda's my favourite toy." My mother was so angry. She walked over to Miranda, deliberately yanked off her little head, tossing it into the wastepaper basket and saying, "Mr. Scotty is your favourite toy from now on. I don't ever want to see him lying on the floor like this again, or I will be very upset. Do you understand, Charlotte?" I nodded and said, "Yes, Mummy. Mr. Scotty is my favourite toy." "Good girl. That's what I like to hear. Now wash your face and come down to breakfast. I've made your favourite, blueberry pancakes." I like pancakes, but my favourite was porridge with honey. But I dutifully nodded, as by now I knew better. When my mother left the bedroom, I dashed over to the bin to retrieve Miranda's decapitated head, but I couldn't fit it back on her body. So I cried and cried. My mother had killed my best friend. She had spitefully murdered my doll in cold blood. I didn't like my new mum for wantonly doing that. Murderers are not good people. But then I reminded myself that I had unintentionally been responsible for murdering my mother, but at least it had not been by design. And in my opinion, that made a huge difference. I resented the fact that my parents were autonomously pretending that I was their dead daughter Charlotte. Did no one like me for being me? My father and sisters wished I had not been born, as I had murdered my mother during childbirth. My new mother and dad electively wanted me to become their new dead daughter, and whenever I providently acted out of character, my mother would become snappy towards me and say, "You're not behaving correctly, Charlotte. You'd never have done that a year ago, would you?" She was rather like a film producer, telling me, the actress, that I was not playing the part appropriately and needed to adopt new mannerisms and quirky eccentric habits to make the role more believable. If I was desirous for my new parents to be happy at all, I had to become a carbon copy or clone of their deceased daughter. I remember asking my new mother how their daughter Charlotte had died, and she said to me, "My daughter is not dead. Where did you get that idea from? You are Charlotte. You're not dead, are you? You're very much alive, are you not?" I nodded, knowing it didn't do well to upset my new mother, as I didn't like it when she wore that sad face, which she always adopted when she wasn't pleased with me. But I knew I was not Charlotte. I was Mereldith, and I hated having to adopt a new alien name that I didn't even like and certainly didn't become me. Sometimes I would do things that would irritate her considerably, like playing with my food on my plate if I didn't like it. She'd become outraged and inflamed and say, "Where does this strange enigmatic habit of yours come from, Charlotte? You've never exhibited such outlandish behaviour before. You used to have such impeccable table manners. What happened? Don't let your good behaviour slip, and don't you ever eat with your mouth open like that. It's not becoming for a young lady. You never ate with your mouth open before. It's very unsightly seeing you chew your food while you eat. No one wants to watch you churning it up with your mouth like that. It's very off-putting and exceedingly distasteful." "Sorry, Mummy," I'd say. "I won't do it again, I promise." I was expected to jump into their bed on a Sunday morning, to sit between two of my parents as they listened to the radio, and I didn't like doing that very much. But as Charlotte had done this every Sunday morning herself, I was expected to do the very same thing. My father wore a black mat on his chest. It was so hairy, and my mother always had plastic curlers in her hair. I was never comfortable sitting between the two of them. My mother would click away at her knitting needles, telling me she was making me a new pink sweater covered with fabric flowers or pom-poms. She always made lovely sweaters, and the little girls at church were envious of them and would play with the pom-poms on my sweater and say, "Mummy, I want a sweater just like Charlotte's." Every Sunday before lunch we would go to church, and I remember the strange looks people gave my new mother when she introduced me to them as Charlotte. "Hello, Charlotte. It's very nice to meet you," they'd say. I overheard one woman saying to her friend, "You're right. It's decidedly odd, isn't it? This new girl they've adopted, they're calling her Charlotte as well. And she looks strikingly similar to their original daughter, the one they lost. The same strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes. It's rather weird, isn't it? I think the parents are clearly in denial. They refuse to admit that their real daughter is dead. People can be like that, you know. They're trying to turn this poor little girl into the daughter they lost. It's tragic, if you ask me, really tragic, but especially for this poor little girl, having to act out like their child. It's not right. It's really rather creepy." "How did their daughter die?" came the other woman's voice. "Wasn't it a drowning accident of some kind?" "Yes, you're right about that. I'm afraid it's a sad story. They found her drowned, lying upside down in the pond. I gather they filled in the pond after that. But I mean, how do you ever get over losing a child? It's so desperately tragic. Let's just say water and little children don't mix, do they? I gather the little girl was taking her plastic dolphin for a swim and ended up falling in the water, and of course she couldn't swim herself, so that was that. The parents tried to save her, but it was too late. She was already gone. How dreadful. I do empathise with them. It's not easy to lose a child, and my heart grieves for them. But I'm sorry, expecting your adopted child to fill your deceased child's shoes is insane. No two kids are the same. I know, I've got 4 of my own, and they couldn't be more different if they tried. And the way Mrs. Arrowmont is behaving, she's acting like this is Charlotte risen from the dead."
In the beginning, my new parents never let me play outdoors without being supervised. They lived on tender hooks if I was outside. I think the tormenting memory of losing their daughter so tragically when she was playing outdoors by the pond meant they were afraid of that same bad thing happening to me. But there was no pond anymore. Slowly and surely my mother's stringent rules began to drop when she discovered she was pregnant and was actually expecting a baby. "You're going to have a new brother or sister," she told me. "Isn't that wonderful, Charlotte? The good Lord has shown me mercy, like Hannah in the Bible. For a long time I thought that I could not have a baby, but now I'm pregnant." The grateful tears streamed down her face. I wondered why she was crying when she claimed to be happy. I decided that adults could be very strange. My new father took me out to celebrate that day. He held my hand and we took a shortcut through the woodgrove, where we were able to get to the local town. I knew the town very well. It wasn't far away from my original old family home. My sister had walked me to the town on many occasions, and I remembered the way very well. If only I could go back home now, I might have nicer things living with the Araminters and living in a bigger, better house. But I didn't like having to be someone I wasn't, and I so missed my dad and my sister. I longed to be back with them. I looked around carefully at all the people bustling around the town to see if I could see any sign of my dad or sister, but they weren't in town today. But then it was a Tuesday, and my father never shopped on Tuesdays. I did remember that. My new father took me to the sweet shop and told me to choose some sweets for myself. "Can I have anything I want?" I asked him with a big smile.
"Charlotte, you can have anything you like. You're a very good girl, and you've made your mummy and daddy very happy. And I'm very pleased we have another bun in the oven, so you can have whatever you want. I am celebrating today."
I looked at my father in bewilderment, secretly affirming to myself that he didn't have a full grasp of the English language. I chose cherry and strawberry gumdrops, candy cigarettes, licorice pipes, chocolate cigarettes, grape laces, assorted Jolly Ranchers, and some M&Ms. I thought all my Christmases had come at once, and as far as I was concerned, my new mother should get pregnant more often, as then I'd get candy and ice cream whenever I wanted, and she wouldn't make me eat all my vegetables. Besides, I noticed that since she'd fallen pregnant, she wore her happy face more often. One day I came into the house, having played happily in the backyard. I brought in a shoebox filled with 6 frogs that I released in the living room to watch them bouncing, jumping and leaping around my mother's posh furnishings and the gleaming oakwood floors. I loved the frogs. They were phenomenal. They could jump so far. They were masterful athletes. "Look, Mummy," I cried out happily. "Look how far the frogs can jump." My mother was absolutely furious. It would seem her pregnancy had given her a short fuse, and she would wear her sad or cross face much more often. My mother let out a shriek. "You wicked girl, Charlotte! You wicked, wicked girl! Why would you do such a dreadful thing? What do you mean by bringing frogs into the house, Charlotte?" She dashed into the kitchen to retrieve a broom and was trying to kill my frogs. Luckily, they escaped her grasp. "Please don't murder my frogs, Mummy. They're nice," I said, quickly gathering them safely back into the shoebox. I couldn't allow my mother to hurt any of them, and judging by her irate expression, she had murder on her mind. "They're dreadful creatures, Charlotte. What on earth is wrong with you? Why can't you be like my real daughter? You're nothing like her. My Charlotte who died, she wasn't at all like you. She'd never ever bring frogs into the house like this. She was such a lovely, lovely, well-behaved girl, a real princess. You're nothing like my real daughter, nothing at all. You don't belong here. I wish you'd go back to where you came from." I didn't realise my mother was just having what adults would probably deem as a blow-up, as she was having a rough day, with morning sickness and low energy levels. So she probably didn't mean what she was saying to me, as everything was overwhelming her and getting on her nerves. But I took my mother at her word, and decided that if she didn't want me any longer, the feeling was mutual. I didn't want her either, and her desire to premeditatively kill my frogs had been the final straw for me. My mother was the murderer of the worst possible kind,
as she had intended to kill. And if I hadn't been efficiently nimble with my fingers, she would have had 6 dead frogs on her conscience. But I doubted that she'd be bothered by that at all. It would seem my mother didn't have a moral compass of any kind. I would find my way back home. All I needed to do was to take the shortcut through the forest, go to the small town, and then find my way back to my quaint little mountain home that I missed with all my heart. I had ambled over to the small town often enough with my sister holding my hand from our mountain home, where she'd buy me candies at the old sweet shop with all the glass bottles in the window, where you could get 10 candies for only 5 cents, that the nice lady in the shop would put in a pink and white striped paper bag for me, and she'd give me 2 extra for being a very good girl. I preferred this sweet shop to the other one that my new dad took me to, as I could choose my own individual sweets, one by one, that I wanted for myself. And I always picked out the special sweets with the prettiest colours, because they were terribly nice. You could suck them, and they stayed in your mouth a lot longer than the grape laces and licorice pipes that got eaten far too quickly. When my mummy was not looking that day, I quickly found a bag which I put my murdered doll's head and body parts into, along with a sweater and a cheese muffin that I stole from the kitchen, in case I got hungry on my journey. I'd intended to have a funeral service for Miranda, my doll, to bury her head in the ground, but I hadn't got around to doing that quite yet, as I knew my mother didn't like me getting my hands dirty. When she saw me digging around in the dirt, pulling out strawberries, she rushed me to the kitchen sink with a look of disgust on her face. She scrubbed my nails and hands so vigorously that they began to bleed. It had really hurt, and I started to cry. My mother had slapped me across the cheek. "Little girls must not go playing in the dirt. It's very unbecoming for a little princess to be covered in filth." I liked my old mountain home, as I could get as dirty as I liked there, play around in the mud, climb trees, ride my little bike. But I wasn't allowed to get dirty in Mrs. Araminta's house. She said princesses always were meant to look pretty, and should never really play outdoors if they could possibly help it. I could hear my new mother in the toilet. She was making horrible noises and guttural sounds. I crept down the staircase. I pushed open the back kitchen door and trotted across the mown lawn, through the flowery meadow, towards the trees. I knew exactly where I was going. Well, I thought I did at the time. It was a magnificently beautiful day, with lots of warm sunshine. I liked it when the weather was warm like this. It felt really nice on my skin. I liked the forest too, as there were so many big trees there, covered with pretty leaves, and the sunlight would dance through the branches and make the whole forest twinkle. I liked the way the birds would sing in the trees, and they made such beautiful music. There were so many charming animals that would look at me in the woods, like chipmunks and squirrels. I think the squirrels in the woodgrove liked me, because they were always eating their acorns in front of me, while they watched me. I'd talk to them, and I'm sure they knew exactly what I was saying. "I'm going back to my real home," I told Mr. Squirrel. "My new mummy doesn't want me any more, because I'm not the same as the other girl, Charlotte, her daughter that died. I don't like her, because she murdered my doll, and she tried to murder 6 frogs." I pulled out the severed head to show the squirrel the macabre evidence of what my mother had so callously done. He continued to eat his acorn, but I got the sense he was very disgusted, and also thought my mother was vindictively cruel for murdering my doll. His dark, soulful eyes looked sympathetic. "I'm going back to my old home," I explained. "I murdered my mother, so my father and my sister are very sad, but I want to go back to them. I didn't mean to murder my mother, you see, 'cause I was small. But my new mother deliberately murdered my doll, and that is so different." I watched the squirrel dashing away. I think he found my story so tragically sad that he just couldn't listen any more. He was so desperately heartbroken. I tried my best to talk to the bunny rabbits, but they would always dart away as fast as they could. I think they were painfully shy. I could understand their feelings, because when I was 3 years old, I was also very shy, just like them. But as I got older, I became a lot more confident. After I'd been walking for a long time, I realized I was lost. I felt very upset because I couldn't find the road that led to the town. so I sat down under the oak tree to cry, as I didn't know how to find that road. It was all very confusing. That was when I saw the hairy lady. I'd never seen a lady like her before, as she was covered in hair, like my teddy bears, very long, so she didn't need to wear clothes, and she was tall and big like a small tree, and her face was pretty, and she had beautiful eyes. She was much nicer than my new mother, and she seemed to really care about me. Even though she didn't speak English, she understood what I was saying, and she literally put me on top of her shoulders, holding down my legs with her hands. They felt so lovely and warm. I'd never seen such big hands before. Her fingers were bigger than sausages. I was so pleased because I love having a horse ride, but she was nicer to ride than a horse. She didn't jolt when she ran. I was giggling so much as I clutched her long hair in my hand like the reins of a horse. I said, "Giddy up! Giddy up!" And she knew I wanted her to go faster, so she moved like the wind. I soon forgot that I was sad, and I began to giggle an awful lot. I couldn't stop laughing. The hairy lady smelt of wood, dirt and pine. I liked her smell an awful lot better. She smelt of the earth after it rains. The kind hairy lady didn't take me to the road as I'd expected she would. Instead, she took me directly to this old wooden cabin that was even more antique-looking than my mountain home. It looked weathered and very run down. The hairy lady put me down gently on the step there. She held me in her arms for a moment, cuddling me tightly to her chest. She was like this giant teddy bear. She was ginormous. She patted me on the back, and then she knocked on the door, but she didn't stay with me. I was sad when she went away. I didn't want her to go. She made me feel safe. The door of the wooden cabin opened, and an old man who looked like Father Christmas opened the door to me. "Are you lost, little girl?" he asked me. I nodded. He poured me a glass of lemonade and asked me what my daddy's name was. I tried to remember, thinking very hard. Then it came to me like a flash of light, as my daddy's surname is the same colour of the grass. "My daddy's name is Sidney Green." The man nodded. He saddled up his horse, and we rode towards my father's cabin. The man said he knew my father well, and knew exactly where he lived. I was very happy about that, but the ride was not as fun as it had been on the nice hairy lady. The man rode to my daddy's cabin, and when he got off his horse he helped me down onto the ground. My father had opened the door with my sister at his side, and when they saw me, they ran towards me, with tears running down their faces. They seemed so happy, so it was really strange that they were crying. "Your little girl was at my front door," the man explained to my father. "She is your daughter, is she not, Sidney?" "That's right," said my father. "She is indeed my daughter. Thank you, George, very much. This is very kind of you to bring my daughter home." The man nods. "Only a pleasure, Sidney. Very glad to be of help." My sister leads me into the cabin, her eyes filled with tears that are slipping down her cheeks like raindrops on a window pane, and the smile on her face is so large that it almost doesn't fit there. She seems excited and incredibly happy. "Would you like some hot chocolate, Meredith?" I nod as she prepares me a mug of cocoa. It tastes so lovely, creamy, sweet and warm, and the sound of being called by my real name is even sweeter. "What happened?" my sister asks. My father is sitting next to me on the other side of the table, and like my sister, he has tears in his eyes and a huge smile on his face. This surprises me an awful lot, as I'd never seen him smile before. I used to make him sad. Now he seems so happy to see me. "What happened, sweetheart?" asks my father, reaching out to grab me by my hand. "Did you not like living with the Araminters? Did you run away?" I open up the plastic bag to show them Miranda, my doll, and the decapitated head. "My new mother murdered my doll," I explained. "She doesn't like me to get my hands dirty, so I couldn't bury her, so we couldn't have a funeral. And then today she tried to kill 6 frogs. "That's very sad," says my sister sympathetically. "Why did she do this to your doll? It's a mean thing for her to do." "'Cause she said that I needed to love Scotty best, because her daughter loved Scotty best." "Who's Scotty?" asked my sister. "Scotty is the teddy bear that belonged to her daughter who died, but I didn't like Scotty. His eyes were too big for his face. They're
daughter's name was Charlotte. They wanted me to be Charlotte, but I'm not Charlotte. I'm Meredith, and I don't want to be Charlotte."
"Of course you're Meredith," said my father. "That's why we called you that name. It suits you. It belongs to you."
"But they didn't call me Meredith. They called me Charlotte, but I'm not Charlotte."
"That's seriously sick," says my father, looking at my sister in horror. "Those bloody people were trying to turn our daughter into their dead child that they lost. Now that is not right." "Did you like living with the Araminters?" asked my father. "Or did you prefer living here with us? I know they have much more money than we do, and they can give you so much more. But we've really missed you. We've missed you so very much, Meredith."
"But you wanted me to go away 'cause I murdered Mummy."
My father grabs hold of me. He picks me up so that my legs are wrapped around his waist and my arms are wrapped around his neck.
"Now you listen to me, my little Meredith. You never killed your mother. Do you understand me? I'm sorry that is what you thought. She was pregnant with you, and the doctors could not save her. But she was very excited about becoming a mother again, and I was so happy about becoming a father. In the beginning we weren't happy, but we came around to the idea about becoming parents again. We both began to warm to the idea of having a late lamb. We were very excited about you. And if you were a girl, you were going to be called Meredith. Your mother loved the name. I admit that I blamed you for your mother dying. I was sad. I loved your mother so terribly much. And when she died, it was easy to blame you for her death. That was very wrong of me. I wanted to blame someone. I blamed God as well, not just you. In truth, I blamed God far more. You see, when you're hurt, Meredith, you lash out at the world because you're angry. When you went away to live at the Araminters, and I saw you getting into her car, I knew in that moment I had made a grievous, monumental mistake. 2 days later, I realized I wanted you back home with us more than anything else in the world. When you went away from home, I realized you were part of your mother, a part of me, a part of your sister, that you were the best thing left behind by your mother for us, and we had overlooked the very best thing in our lives, like a precious jewel that you realize suddenly is really a diamond, when all along you thought it was a piece of costume jewelry. I had handed over the most precious gift to someone else in the world. I was mortified. You see, little Meredith, I love you so much."
"Daddy's right, Meredith," says my sister. "We were so gutted. I blame myself, as I thought our lives would be better without you. But it was terrible. We missed you so terribly much, and we cried all the time. Daddy contacted the Araminters at once. We told them we had to have you back. But they told us you were calling them Mummy and Daddy, that you were terribly happy, and you much preferred living with them, and they were spoiling you rotten, giving you your heart's desires."
"We believed them," said my father. "We knew if you were happy, we had to let you go."
"But I wasn't happy. I wanted to be here with you."
My father contacted the Araminters to tell them that I'd run away from their home and returned safely to my mountain home, and that I would be staying with them from now on, and that there was nothing they could do because I was legitimately his daughter. I was so thrilled to be back home, and even happier when my father fixed my doll's head back onto her body again, so that she came back to life, and we didn't have to have a funeral service for her, so I was overjoyed. I so wished I could tell Mr. Squirrel the great news. My story had grieved his heart so very much that he'd run away after he'd eaten his acorn. The following morning, Mrs. Araminta was knocking at our door, after parking her black Buick outside our rustic cabin, that possibly looked like a yard shed to her. She was carrying Mr. Scotty in her hands, and her face was the colour of a bright tomato. She was wearing her angry face, and I was very scared of that face, because bad things happened when she wore that look, like slapping me across the face, scrubbing my fingers until they bled, or hosing me down with ice-cold water.
"Don't be frightened, little Meredith," said my father, taking my hand in his. "Mrs. Araminta cannot take you away against our will." Mrs. Araminta stormed into our cabin. She looked like a soldier. She seemed to be marching. My father beckoned for her to sit down on a chair. She looked at our humble home with an expression of contemptuous disgust on her face, as our cabin was not resplendent enough for her. My sister kept our cabin as spotless and clean as a new pin. It was homely, with its mismatched furnishings and homemade curtains, and Mrs. Araminta was not impressed. She heaved a huge sigh, and sat on the edge of a slightly weather-beaten chair, as if she was scared she'd become contaminated by the fabric. "What's this all about? How dare you kidnap our daughter?" she says, glaring at my father with indignant eyes that are as wide as saucers. "Charlotte belongs home with us. I told you she's very happy in her new life, with her new mummy and daddy. Aren't you, Charlotte, sweetheart?" she says, looking at me with a bright big smile on her face. "Look what I brought you, dear. Mr. Scotty," she says, lifting up the bear with the tartan jacket, gold buttons and hideously big bug eyes. She reaches over to where I'm sitting to place Mr. Scotty in my arms, but I throw the teddy across the floor in indignant disgust. "I hate that teddy." Mrs. Araminta looks most upset as she gathers Scotty up from the floor in her hands, dusting him off and clutching him closely to her chest. "Charlotte, that wasn't a nice thing to do. Look what you made my daughter do. I can see she's very upset. She'd never ever hurt Mr. Scotty unless she was upset. You are keeping her against her will. She wants to come home with me, where she belongs." "First of all, Mrs. Araminta, I did not kidnap Meredith from you. On the contrary, Meredith ran away from your home because she wasn't happy living with you. If my daughter had been happy with you, she would never have run away from you in the first place. And then under those circumstances, I would have been more than willing for her to stay with you, because that would be her choice, her decision, because she was happy. I miss my daughter so terribly much. She's not happy living with you, and trying desperately to please you by filling your dead daughter's shoes. And that is a dreadful burden to put on a young girl. My daughter is not your dead child. No child is your dead child. You should appreciate that. And she doesn't like being called Charlotte either. Her name is Meredith." Mrs. Araminta looks physically stunned. "Did you run away from home yesterday, Charlotte?" she asks me. I nod. "I know Mummy was upset yesterday and said things to you she didn't mean, but I wasn't feeling well. I was sick because of my pregnancy. But I'm going to make it up to you, I promise, Charlotte. I'll take you shopping, buy you a brand new doll, and we can go to that lovely ice cream parlour, and you can have as much ice cream as you want. Now, won't that be nice?" I shook my head vigorously. "I don't want to come back with you, Mrs. Araminta. You're not my mummy anyway. I belong here, home with my daddy and my sister." "Now, there's no need to be like that, Charlotte. You don't want to live in this dreadful place. Look at it. It's so tiny in here, and the furniture doesn't even match. I mean, we live in such a large red-bricked home, and you have a beautiful bedroom with a princess carriage bed." "Well, you've heard her, Mrs. Araminta. You've had your answer. My daughter does not want to come home with you. She wants to stay with us. She's my daughter legally. You don't have a leg to stand on, I'm afraid." "We'll see about that," says Mrs. Araminta, storming out of the cabin. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers very soon. I'll be fighting you tooth and nail in court." "You haven't got a leg to stand on, as I keep telling you, Mrs. Araminta," says my father, beginning to chuckle. In the weeks and months that followed, we never heard from the Aramintas again. My daddy said it was because their lawyers would have told her that she had no legal grounds to claim me as her daughter, as there was no legitimate paperwork done at the time. Suffice to say, life was better in the cabin than ever before, as my father lavished his undivided love on me, as did my sister. So I began to realize how loved I was, and that it wasn't my fault that my mother had died during childbirth, so I wasn't a murderer after all, and that made me very happy indeed. One day I decided to seek Mr. Squirrel out, to tell him the great news, and that Miranda, my doll, had miraculously come back to life, because I knew how upset he'd been to hear my story, I wanted to tell him I'd got it all wrong, but the problem was all the squirrels in the woodgrove looked exactly the same. How would I know which was the squirrel who was so sad? I decided to talk to all of them, so one late afternoon I wandered off into the woodgrove and spoke to every squirrel I encountered, and there were lots and lots of them. I just want you to know that I'm not a murderer, because I didn't really kill my mummy, and I also wanted you to know that Miranda, my dog, has literally come back to life again. She's no longer dead, I told the squirrels. They seemed happy to hear my news, as they ate their acorns and looked at me through their dark, sultry eyes. I knew that they understood what I was saying, as they kept nodding their heads when they were eating. Mr. Squirrel would feel much better now that he knew the truth, and would no longer be sad. I suddenly became very scared, as in a trice the woodgrove became quite dark, and I couldn't find my way back home. I couldn't actually remember the way I'd come, and I knew I was lost, so I sat under the tree to cry again. And then I saw the hairy lady again. I was so relieved to see her. She always made me feel so much better. She knew what to do when I was sad. I was surprised to see that her stomach was very big. I knew she must be carrying a baby. She pointed to her belly and put my hand on her stomach to feel it. I could feel something kicking inside. It made me happy. I noticed her breasts were not small anymore. They had grown like two big balloons that had blown up for a birthday party. My hairy friend looked so happy. She held me in her arms and rocked me for a while. And then she put me on her back again, and we went riding through the woodgrove. I was so excited because I was having another ride again, and I hadn't seen her for so long. It was good to see her again, and it felt like I was riding a horse, but only it was smooth without those awful bumpy jolts. I thought she'd take me to the man who looked like Father Christmas again, but I was surprised to see she knew where I lived and took me straight home to my cabin. When my daddy opened the door to see me sitting on her shoulders, he looked visibly shocked, very, very confounded. I thought his eyes would drop out of his face as they grew so large, and his mouth was so big he could have caught a fly with it. The hairy lady put me on the ground and spoke to my dad in her language. My father understood the language because he nodded and said thank you very much. She nodded, patted me on the back, and glided away. My daddy was very excited about the hairy lady, telling my sister he'd never met such an extraordinary creature.
She spoke to me in my head. She told me Meredith was lost.
I wonder what she was, my sister asked my dad. She's the hairy lady, I explained, wondering why my father didn't know who she was. I was 16 years old, and one day singing in the church choir. Who should walk into the church but Mrs. Araminta herself, with her 8-year-old daughter, wearing a pink sweater, covered in pom-poms, and in her arms she was carrying Mr. Scotty. I could hardly believe it. The girl also had strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes and looked exactly like photographs I'd seen of the daughter that they'd had that died. "Charlotte!" she cries out to her daughter, who was running towards some leaves that had blown into the church. "Come back here right now!" It was hard to believe she had called her new daughter Charlotte. I felt sorry for the poor girl and wondered if she was being forced to like Mr. Scotty and to like chicken pot pie above every other food choice. I was to learn later on in life, when I was a lot older, that the hairy lady I encountered in the woodgrove was known as a Bigfoot. I hasten to say I did see her one more time, and that was when she knocked on our cabin door in the middle of the night. My father immediately grabbed his rifle when he heard the strange knocking sound, as we weren't used to being disturbed like this. Me and my sister ran to the door, curious to see what was going on, and there she was, standing in the full light of the moon. She looked beautiful, lofty, majestic, and in her arms she was carrying her baby and holding it up for my father to see. "She's beautiful," said my father, and the hairy lady showed my father that it wasn't a girl but a little boy, by pointing out his anatomy. "Oh, I apologize," said my father. "He is beautiful." The hairy lady's eyes gleamed, and she let my father and my sister hold her baby, while she sat down on the porch steps and rocked me in her arms. My father told me later she'd just given birth, and she and her partner were moving away, and she'd come to say goodbye. My father claimed she'd spoken to him in his head. I was sad because I never saw the hairy lady again, but even now as an older woman, I hold her memory so dearly in my heart. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Carl, and I was born in the 40s in the Pacific Northwest, and was found in a little pedal bin in a girl's toilet cubicle by a cleaner at a girls' school. They never did find out who my mother was in those days. They established that it must have been a young teenage girl who had fallen pregnant and given birth to me in secret in the restrictive confines of a tiny toilet cubicle. I cannot imagine what a traumatic experience my birth must have been for such a young girl. I think she possibly did not realise she was pregnant at the time with me, or if she did, she concealed the pregnancy from her family and friends exceedingly well, and was not sagacious, prudent, or judicious enough to make any pragmatic and practical decisions in regards to me long term. I think she possibly hoped that if she didn't think about me, her predicament would magically be vanquished from her life and just disappear altogether. I gather the sanctimonious, rather pretentious and pompous school kept the matter of my birth very hush-hush and brushed it under the carpet, sheltering the school from any thorny scandals. For it would seem that knowledge of my birth might have caused many parents to become unduly alarmed that an underage girl in the school that their scrupulous children attended had given birth in a toilet. I gather there was a brief, very obscure report written in the local paper about my strange arrival in the world, but the name of the school was never mentioned for obvious reasons. I harbour no anger or resentment towards my mother. Neither do I even condemn her for the peculiar way in which I was found in the rubbish bin, although in truth I would have preferred her to have left me on a doorstep or on a church pew. I feel certain she was a frightened, naive, whimsical teenager who was just so overwhelmed by giving birth to me. She just didn't know how to handle what had happened to her. I think tossing me in that pedal bin meant that she could cast out her problem like you would a piece of toilet roll and not think about it anymore, out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. I am sure she was terrified of the repercussions of being pregnant, the reproachful stigmas and long-term contemptuous ramifications of having a baby so young and out of wedlock. For believe me, in those days it was something highly slanderous and shamefully frowned upon. Many people were even disowned by their parents in such situations. I'll never know her true story. I wish I did. But I can discern that she was a very confused, frightened young girl, and for that I harbour no ill feelings towards her. How could I? Just compassion and empathy. Even years later, my mother never ever came forward to acknowledge that she was the one that had given birth to me in secret in a toilet cubicle at such a young, tender age. Nor did she make any inquiries about me. I think she kept her mouth shut because she was so frightened for the condemnation and judgment she would possibly receive. And she probably harboured this horrifying, humbling secret all her life, of which she took to the grave. As you can imagine, I was placed by the rigid, uncompromising authorities in the care of an apathetic, impassionate foster home for the first 6 years of my life. And then, much like a soccer ball, I was tossed around from one aloof and diffident foster home to another, living in areas like Washington State, Wyoming, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, all places in the Pacific Northwest. Some families that took me under their wings were kind and congenial, while others were indifferent and lukewarm towards me. In truth, I never felt fully loved, cherished, or accepted, so I learnt to survive all on my own from a very young, tender age to become independent, cloistered, and solitary, which possibly explains why I've been a very contented, unsociable loner all of my life, and have never married or had children of my own, nor have I ever regretted being a loner. My strange story that ultimately led to a curious Bigfoot encounter began when I was given a job in the early 80s, when I responded to an advertisement in the local paper to become a school caretaker for a local school in Washington State, which required living on the school premises and locking up the classrooms after hours, as well as doing mandatory checks throughout the night on the premises just to ensure that everything was in order, secure, and there were no attempted break-ins or fire hazards to contend with. I was hired on the spot by the amenable headmistress who warmed to me at once and liked the fact that I was a free-spirited person and a solitary maverick who thrived on singular company and was content living on my own in a bohemian, non-conformist lifestyle with my black and white cat I called Wildfire, a name that she valiantly earned from her bravery and courage. She had been rescued from a burning home by the fire brigade. I gather she had belonged to an elderly lady who had set a chip pan alight during the night and had completely forgotten about it, and she died in the fire due to the toxic fumes. Wildfire reminded me rather of myself, a born survivor, so I immediately adopted her, and I never regretted that decision. It's a very lonely, isolated job, I had been warned by the headmistress, not for the faint-hearted, but I need someone on the premises at all times for my own peace of mind. And so it was that I moved into a very rudimentary basic wooden cabin that was built in the 1800s and was situated on the rear of the school grounds, tucked away in a shaded clearing that was heavily flanked by an area of thick national forest and was once the home of the original headmistress that had been responsible for opening the first school in 1932. Before long I settled into my life on the school grounds with my cat Wildfire, and despite the hermetical simplicity of my life, I was very contented and satisfied as a human being. I suppose I was so used to solitude, and the modest demands of my most pressing needs were easily met, as I didn't need much to live very well. It was the simple things in life that I relished and appreciated the most. I enjoyed spending my time reading novels that I took out from the local library. I relished feeding the birds during the day and watching them gathering on my bird table to eat breadcrumbs. One of them, an initially reticent little robin, had become incredibly tame and was now perching confidently on my hand, eating crumbs from me, which was extraordinary, and I was absolutely thrilled. Every night I would walk around the school, rattling and jangling a large bunch of keys in my hands, checking the classrooms and locking up everything behind me, always shadowed by Wildfire that liked to follow me around like a devoted lap dog. One day as I was locking up one of the classrooms, my flashlight detected a little movement under one of the desks, and that was when I saw these frightened brown eyes staring back at me in alarm. I suddenly realised I was staring at a 9-year-old little boy. I was shocked. "Please, sir," said the boy, "don't tell anyone I'm here." I reassured the young boy that being in a freezing cold classroom on a bitter winter's evening was not the way for a growing young man to spend the long, lonely night. I took him back to my cottage immediately, where I prepared him a hot cup of chocolate and made him something to eat, while he sat back warming up against the crackling fire, looking heartily relieved. "Where are your parents?" I asked him, looking at him through my wizened eyes, as he gobbled up my hot pot very hungrily. "My mother's dead," he said. "I think she died when I was very little, of a brain aneurysm. My father takes care of me now." "Where is your father?" I asked. "Why did he not pick you up from school today?" "He's a drunk, sir. He often forgets to pick me up." "That's not good," I said. "Do you have any other family?" "I have a grandmother that lives in Wyoming. She's very nice, sir." "What's her name?" I asked. "Joy Jenkins," he said. Before long I managed to trace this young boy's grandmother, and I phoned her to tell her about her grandchild being left behind at school, and the woman was utterly appalled. "I knew I couldn't trust my wretched son to take care of my grandchild," she piped. "Ever since Tanny died, that was his wife, of course, he's never been the same. I told him he needed to pull his socks up and get a grip, as he has a child to raise, but he's like a pig wallowing in the mud. I mean, it's ridiculous. He seems so determined to drag everybody else down with him. Selfish sod," she said. "I mean, I know he's been through a lot of emotional trauma, but his wife's been dead for 7 long years now. He needs to take some kind of responsibility towards the boy. It's not all about him, you know. Oh, look, I really do appreciate that you're not getting the authorities involved. I will come to get my grandson immediately." I am glad to say that the grandmother was true to her word, and that little boy was just over the moon to be reunited with her. She ruffled his hair affectionately and told him that he would not be spending any more nights hiding under school desks, and the poor little boy looked heartily relieved. I was delighted for him. I'm also glad to say that the grandmother was legally able to adopt her grandson, which was the very best thing that could have happened to the little boy. I'm pleased I did not call the authorities, because I knew what it was like from bitter experience having social services caught up in the nitty-gritty of your lives and hovering over your life like a sparrowhawk, waiting to pounce on anything that did not conform to their unyielding regulations. That was the last thing I wanted for that poor boy. I made it my duty to visit him from time to time and take him out for a day of fishing or so. I could find out whether he was being treated right by his grandmother that way, and my troubles were laid to rest when he revealed that he was very happy and making lots of friends at his brand new school. So I was very pleased for him. One morning, several days after that incident, I awoke up early to unlock all the classrooms after a heavy night of torrential rain. I noticed these huge muddy footprints that led from the forest all around the outer perimeters of the school, and it concerned me greatly that there must be a trespasser on the premises looking to break into one of the classrooms. There was only one big problem, and that was that the person walking on the premises had a slightly deformed foot, which might explain why he did not wear shoes, as I noticed the big toes on both feet were splayed to the right, and the second oddity was that his feet were absolutely enormous. But I told myself that the rain might have enlarged the footprints, because water has the propensity to enlarge anything. I quickly covered up the footprints, as I didn't want the fastidious headmistress to become unduly alarmed. The heavy rainfall lasted for several long days, and every morning I would discover these strange muddy footprints around the school, and I would also discern smudges on windows that looked like someone had been pressing their noses against the glass panes. But that couldn't be possible, could it? Because the nose smudges were 8 feet off the ground. No one could be 8 foot tall, surely, I thought to myself. As you can imagine, I was befuddled by this increasing, rather perplexing conundrum. So it was on a Monday morning I climbed through the pole fencing and walked through the Sylvan, which is an area of forest I have never explored before. I knew it had been accessible to the public for many years, with hiking trails and so forth, and yet I hadn't ventured out there myself. I gathered by word of mouth and from what the headmistress had told me that the forests were considered haunted, and people had seen strange sightings and heard enigmatic anomalies in the woods, like yellow and blue light orbs, dark shadowy creatures, UFO activity, and peculiar screaming noises. Some people claimed to have walked into the area only to report experiences of missing time, of which they had no explanation for. I was a natural cynic, and so did not believe in this hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense, so I really didn't give the matter any further thought or consideration, and put it all down to rumours, idle speculation, and quirky superstitions. I do remember thinking how beautiful the verdant coniferous forest was that consisted largely of exceedingly tall, towering Douglas firs, spruces and western hemlock trees, and there was moss that swathed the tree trunks, draping branches and rocky outcrops in velvety green carpets. There was pretty lacy ferns that stretched out their resplendent, delicate emerald leaves across the forest floor. I also noticed some rugged-looking trails that I chose to follow through the elevated inclines that were surrounded by rocks, caverns and rocky ridges, and streams of water that cascaded and trickled over the rocks in a small, flowing, gentle stream. I could hear the pretty bird song in the valley, and could see some cute little cottontail rabbits hopping around the wood green, along with the odd squirrel darting up a tree, observing me with big brown curious eyes. Suddenly my attention was drawn to this cave, submerged in the ground, surrounded by rocky outcrops that were strewn with moss. The hollow tunnelled deep within the ground, and was seemingly exceedingly large. I decided I wanted to take a look into this cave that was sheltered from the elements, as I was sure that this would be the perfect quintessential spot for a vagrant to live. I would myself if I lived out in the woods. The opening was small and branched out to a very sizable cave, and on the ground I saw a very large nest that was covered in soft grasses, and lying within the nest were 2 curled-up creatures that looked like dark brown bear cubs. I now began to freak out, because there is nothing more treacherous than a mother bear and her cubs, and if you get close and personal to a mother bear's cubs, you're in grievous danger and trouble, let me tell you. I knew she was possibly somewhere close around, and I began to hastily make my way out of the cave. But then I heard her coming back, and I began to panic. Luckily in the cave there was one big stone in the far corner that I could hide behind and remain very still, provided I crouched down very low. My one concern was that the bear would smell me, because they have the most phenomenal sense of smell. But I was trapped, and I had no better option of escape other than to remain remarkably still. That was when I saw her as she entered the cave, but then I realised to my amazement that this was no bear. What was it? This was something completely different. In her hand she was carrying 3 dead rabbits, but I did not know what she was, for she looked like she was half human and half ape. There was enough light in the cave to see her clearly, but in a dim light, if you know what I mean. This critter was about 7.5 to 8 feet tall and about 700 pounds or less, and she was very burly, solid and sinewy, with excessively large shoulders, long arms and powerful sturdy legs. She was covered in long flowing brown hair that was a lighter colour to her cubs. I noticed her head was triangular and literally folded into the shoulders with no evidence of a neck. The face was heart-shaped but very long, and the nose large but very flat, and the brow ridge wrinkled. She had a very wide but thin mouth and deep-set dark eyes. I was so dumbfounded that she was not a bear, but I was not relieved because I thought by the look of her she could possibly kill a bear without breaking a sweat. I mean, this critter was so powerful and intimidating looking, she was built like an apex predator that is designed to take down very big prey. I did not want to be that prey. The critter made a chattering sound, and the two little ones rose up from their long sleep, stretching out their overlong arms like a human would do once they rise out of their beds. They were both about 3 foot tall and looked identical, so I'm pretty certain they might have been twins, but I can't be sure of that either. She handed them each a rabbit that they began to eat, much like we would a hot dog, but from the inside out, leaving out the outer pelt, like the skin of an avocado or a pawpaw. I could hear all three of the critters eating and gnawing, and all of a sudden the ape-like humanoid, or mother if you like, sniffed the air, and that was when I knew my cover was immediately blown, and I really thought I was living on borrowed time. I froze to the spot and my stomach began to churn like butter. I felt nauseous and sick, like I wanted to throw up. I was terrified. She walked towards the stone where I was hiding, and the expression on her face was one of utter astonishment. I think she was so baffled to see me in her den that she was possibly unable to react immediately. She just stared and stared at me with an agog expression on her face, with her deep-set treacle-coloured eyes. She looked stupefied. All of a sudden, one of her little younglings exuberantly came darting towards me, chattering with excitement and enthusiasm, and offering me some of her dead rabbit, and her sweet actions seemed to break the ice. Suddenly, it would seem, instead of being the enemy, I had become a much welcomed house guest, as the tense atmosphere suddenly lifted and subsided and became very convivial. The youngsters kept offering me bites of their rabbit, and watching in absolute delight as I chewed the pieces of very unpalatable, raw, disgusting flesh, which I pretended to find absolutely delicious, which made the little ones exceedingly pleased. I spoke to them like I would talk to two young toddlers, and they seemed unconcerned about the fact that I looked remarkably different to them. It was really no different than playing with two human toddlers that want to play housey-housey with you. The energy was very relaxed. I can honestly say that these two younglings made the mother much more amenable towards me, and she began to physically relax as I played with them. In fact, I think she was quite happy that they had a distraction and were not demanding too much of her attention, like any younglings naturally always do. Before long, they were playing with my hair and marvelling at the soft texture of it, and making so many whoops that even the mother curiously came to examine it. She let out a delighted whoop herself when she touched my hair and discovered how soft it was, and then she even smelt it. I distinctly remember her going, "Ooh!" How long those younglings played with my hair, I don't know. They didn't seem to grow tired of it, and I certainly did. Even the mother was teaching them how to braid, and they were so excited and fascinated by it. So by the time I did manage to leave the cave, I was covered in hundreds of very tight little plaits that looked exactly like dreadlocks. I managed to say my goodbyes to the critters, who clearly did not want me to go, and even the mother had enjoyed being relieved of her babysitting duties. But thankfully I succeeded in worming my way out of the cave. I was glad to get away. I was almost scared of becoming their prisoner. But at the same time, I knew I had experienced something pretty special. Later that afternoon, I had an appointment with the headmistress and completely forgot about my rag-tailed braided hair, and I'll never forget how the headmistress kept giving me a peculiar, disapproving look. I wondered why she was looking at me like that. Then she said, "Carl, I don't mean to speak out of term, but this is a very conservative school, and I know you're only a caretaker, but I am not keen on my staff wearing dreadlocks. It's just not very appropriate for a school, if you know what I mean. It's not a look that we take very well here. Yes, ma'am, I said. I'll fix it. I soon realised that the big feet in the muddy ground after the rain and the smudge marks on the windows must have belonged to the female critter that I'd encountered. I never concerned myself with her presence around our school, as I knew she meant no harm, really, but was just curious about the school and its kids. As for the little critters, I never visited them again, but there were times I would hear them whooping across the valley, and it always brought a smile to my face. I am now an old man, living in a retirement home. I'd like to be living on my own, but I can't, as I need help. But I do have friends, more friends than I've ever had in my life, but looking back on my life as a caretaker at the school, I do so with many fond memories. And it was 20 years ago that I discovered that the critters I encountered all those years ago were Bigfoot, and I was encouraged by one of the staff to write to you. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.